Chapter 475. At the end of the last constitutional era, the Federation and the Empire suddenly met, and then began a war that lasted for decades. The Westwoods region at the front line had a large number of troops all year round, especially during wartime. Soldiers and war supplies from all the galaxies of the Federation gathered here. Warships silently cruised outside the atmosphere. Transport ships like a flock of birds passed through the sky above the city. The people walking on the bustling streets had long been used to calm expressions, but the figures in dark military uniforms that often appeared showed that this place had long become a magnificent military camp. The Sunset State, the main planet of the Westwoods, was famous for its silver beaches and blue seas. It was the top tourist destination in the Federation, and at that time, the service industry here was extremely developed. Decades of martial law had caused the tourism industry in the Sunset State to shrink, but the countless batches of Federation soldiers resting here made the service industry more developed and more direct. Where there were people, there were rivers and lakes. Where there were men, there were brothels. The soldiers of the Federation who retreated from the front line back to the main planet to rest were tens of thousands of bachelors. Their bodies were full of hunger and thirst, and they were greatly stimulated by the life and death battles on the battlefield. So naturally, they needed to find a place to vent. The Federation government and military had always maintained a silent and non-interfering attitude towards the places and sanatoriums all over the Sunset State. They couldn't let the brave soldiers shed blood and tears on the front line and not find a way to have fun when they returned to the rear. That would be too loveless. Once there was no love, what followed was hatred, and that was why the rate of sex crimes in the West Woods sharply increased. As the saying goes, turn a blind eye to it so that everyone would feel better. 23 Blue Sea Street, the capital of the Sunset State, was a nightclub called Golden Splendor. This independent building that looked like a blue luminous box was rumored to have collected beautiful girls from all over the Federation. Whether it was the decoration or the service, it was extremely luxurious and charming. A place like this was not a place that ordinary soldiers could explore with their allowance, but it didn't prevent the army from describing this place as a man's holy land. But tonight, this nightclub attracted a lot of trouble. At the entrance, officers left with gloomy expressions from time to time. In the last crowd, a major stared coldly at the manager. Listening to the manager's gentle explanation, he was in an extremely bad mood. They were the rotational warfare officers from the 2nd Military Region. Tonight, they had to entertain a few of their comrades who had just retired from the front lines. These comrades belonged to a well-known unit in the 3rd Military Region. They were obviously not qualified enough for a normal occasion, but what made them feel extremely embarrassed was that when they arrived at the entrance, they were actually refused entry by the nightclub. Although they were angry, the officers did not overreact. Since the Golden Resplendents dared to open a business in the capital of the Sunset Province, where the military ran rampant and had been operating in such a high profile for decades, it naturally had a very deep background behind it. He could only throw down a few words in annoyance and resentfully turn to leave. The nightclub manager looked at the back of the officer as he left. He straightened his body that had been bowing and apologizing. He couldn't help but wipe the cold sweat on his forehead and sigh softly. Of course, his boss wasn't afraid of a mere major, but as a subordinate, he didn't dare to provoke these soldiers who couldn't find a way to vent their anger. Turning around and looking at the nightclub that he had managed for several years, a bitter smile appeared on the manager's face. He wondered what the origin of the army inside was. The Golden Resplendents, which was enough to accommodate 500 guests at the same time, was actually booked by a few dozen people without any hesitation. In terms of background, Group 7 was without a doubt the most untouchable team. This team was filled with the descendants of the chairman, the sons of the governor, and the sons of tycoons. To go against the forces behind these princes at the same time, other than the strong and stubborn President Pabre, probably only someone with a temperament like Sulu could do it. This group of old soldiers who didn't care about the amount of money naturally didn't understand the meaning of sharing and saving. To spend an allowance of 170,000 yuan per person in one night, other than the Golden Resplendents, there was really no other place to go. It's nothing. Normal people wouldn't dare to provoke this nightclub. Bai Yulan walked back from the entrance and said to the slightly worried Sulu, "The owner of this nightclub has some connections. I heard that he can freely enter and leave Latitude 2 District 36. Sulu felt that this name was familiar and asked, "Where is this place?" "The old house of the Zhong family in the West Woods," Bai Yulan replied. Sulu nodded. Someone who could freely enter and leave the old house of the Zhong family probably didn't dare to provoke in the West Woods. But why did the address of the old house of the Zhong family sound so familiar to him? While he was seriously recalling, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of music coming from downstairs. The outer walls of the Golden Resplendence nightclub were covered with faint blue lights, but the lights inside the building were mainly lavender, reflecting on the black and gray decorative walls and floor, making it look quite stylish. On the wine island carved from fragrant wood, there were all kinds of mixed drinks, and the lavender lights rippled in the wine, creating a charming hue. To the west was an exaggerated glass wall, and the wall was filled with natural seawater. Countless small golden fish were following two long golden arowanas as they swam up and down. Inside the transparent hall on the second floor, waitresses in extremely short uniforms were carrying black wooden trays, smiling as they wandered around. Their slender, white high heels supported their slender white legs, and the exquisite design of their uniforms outlined the curves of the young girls. When the soothing music became slightly more passionate, the waitresses' long legs seemed to become lighter, and with their soft waists and bright red, full lips on their delicate faces, it was enough to arouse the desire in the depths of any man's heart. The members of Group 7 talked and laughed loudly as they drank the good wine in their glasses. Not long after, all the mixed drinks were taken away and replaced with June No. 3. June brandy, one of the most famous spirits in the Federation, was produced in the Ganzhou Hills district of Region S3. Among them, No. 3 was a treasure that had been in the cellar for more than 30 years. Not only was it expensive, but it was also rare. These rich kids ordered 80 bottles of No. 3 as soon as they opened their mouths. Even the Golden Resplendence was caught off guard, and it took them a full 20 minutes to get it. Alcohol, music, cigarettes, and beautiful women. A psychedelic atmosphere shrouded the air inside the building, washing away the light purple lights and making them even dimmer. Some of the members of Group 7 were playing billiards, some were throwing darts, and some were already drunk. They were doing something they would never do in the Capitol Ring, and that was holding a microphone and singing the military's bloody battle song with a hoarse voice as if their lives depended on it. A few of the members who drank an entire bottle of spirits in 5 minutes were already drunk, and their eyes were in a mess. For some reason, sorrow rose from their hearts, and they hugged the people beside them and cried bitterly. Then, they got up and drank again and laughed exaggeratedly. The so-called battlefield PTSD, or the thought of sacrificed comrades, always made people more emotional like little animals. The manager and service staff of the nightclub had long been used to this kind of scene, but they were a little moved by the extravagance of these soldiers and secretly hoped that these people would not cause trouble after drinking. Since they had booked the whole place, all the girls in the nightclub came out. A few hundred girls accompanied the 80 to 90 men, and each member had 2 or 3 girls next to them. Although the forest of flesh beside the wine pool was covered by trimmed willow leaves, it could not hide the waves of perfume and fragrance that filled the entire place. The scene was spectacular. The girls' eyes were like flowers. Although they were young, they had already seen countless people, and they had long seen the difference in this group of soldiers. Although they looked like ordinary soldiers, the stack of cash that appeared in their soft breasts from time to time made them wonder if they had the right to say that they were knowledgeable. Were there really so many rich young masters and soldiers in this world? Sulu and a few officers sat in the largest private room on the second floor. In front of them, there were members who rushed upstairs to propose a toast. Even he was forced to drink a few glasses, and he was a little tipsy. In the end, he could not resist the eager and passionate gazes of the people around him, and he agreed to let the girls in. The most important thing in the Federal Army was honor, a sense of belonging, and a strict hierarchy. Everything had to be followed by rules. Even the absurd collective whoring of prostitutes had to be followed by rules. Therefore, the most famous girls of the majestic nightclub had always been reserved for this big box. None of the members downstairs dared to talk to them. The red car girls who had been standing outside the door for a long time were very curious about the guests who had booked the whole place today, and even more so, they wanted to know who was sitting in the main private room. At this time, when the order was given, the girls entered in a line with guessing intentions. They lined up in 2 rows in front of the main room. Some bowed their heads shyly, some were calm and gentle, and some had vicissitudes of life in their eyes. There were many different styles. At this time, Sulu put down his wine glass and subconsciously looked up. Suddenly, he saw a girl wearing a black dress looking at him with her mouth slightly open. A trace of surprise flashed through his heart. He felt that this girl was somewhat familiar, as if he had seen her somewhere before. At this time, the members in the private room, who had long been unable to hold themselves back, began to take attendance. Shi Peng, who had the highest status among the young masters, had long been accustomed to his existence as Su Li's personal guard. He held a thick stick of tobacco and very familiarly arranged people. Of course, he first arranged the best girl to be next to Su Lu. No one would have thought that at this time, the girl wearing the black dress gently clenched her fists and nervously walked over to Su Lu. This was definitely against the rules. Shi Peng's eyebrows wrinkled. The female manager who led the team into the room had a slightly panicked expression. She didn't know if she would offend these people of unknown origin, but obviously not to be trifled with. At this time, Su Lu suddenly scratched his head and happily grinned. He didn't dare to be sure and asked, "Lulu?" The girl wearing the black dress was slightly startled. It seemed that she didn't expect this little boy to remember her name. A trace of pleasant surprise appeared on her face, and she sweetly smiled and sat down. The room was silent. Whether it was the members or the girls, they all looked at the young man and woman in astonishment. The girls were shocked that Lulu actually knew this big shot who was obviously a senior officer. The members of Group 7 were more shocked and envious. They secretly thought to themselves, no wonder the frontline troops always said that their manager was a dog that bites, but doesn't bark. What a well-behaved young man. Who would have thought that he was actually such a playboy? As the prospective son-in-law of the Minister of Defense, he had an ambiguous relationship with the national idol who was doted on by tens of thousands of people. He even had who knows how many times with that Green Dragon Mountain Z. Now that he was countless light years away from the capital ring, he could actually casually walk into a nightclub and see his old flame. I'm going home. I need to quickly pass the road test in the next 2 days and then go back to Daqing to fix up the house. The feeling during the annual meeting was actually very good. It was rare for everyone to get together, drink some wine, and talk. To be honest, what we talked about was mostly about writing books. We were more dedicated to our work than we thought. As for the card game that White Burr mentioned, that was organized by that guy. 72, the Enchantress, and I were all dragged to the table by him. 72, the Enchantress, and I didn't know how to play at all. I swear on my father's integrity that this fatty did this last year. We only played for an hour in total. 72, and I didn't lose a single cent and didn't win a single cent. The winner won very little and even had to treat us to hot pot. Snowball had more than 10 people and played 2 tables. The Enchantress paid the bill and won the Enchantress. They only won 40 renminbi. Isn't this a huge loss? P.S. Speaking of the book, I really wrote that chapter when I was drunk. Today, I seriously looked back and found that other than a few typos, the quality was really good. It was very unexpected. During the dinner at night, I was still chatting with my friends. After drinking, I could only write poems, but it was difficult to write stories. Except for a god like Blood Red. But it seems that is not the case. Although drinking makes one sleepy, as long as one's obsession is strong enough and one keeps the promise, one can always write something good. Yesterday, when they saw the words resplendent on the road to Kunming, all the comrades from Shanghai collectively exclaimed, "Of course, you have to believe that I'm from CJ. All of us are from CJ. This is the truth. This society is not as CJ as we want it to be. If you seriously think about it, this group of otakus who write web novels are the most CJ people. Chapter 476. The door was tightly shut, and the music in the luxurious private room started again, but no one was singing. In the mixed atmosphere of tobacco and alcohol, the members of Group 7 and the red card girls beside them whispered to each other. They seemed to be chatting happily, but in fact, their eyes and hearts were always looking in that direction. The high-grade, densely woven fabric covering the sofa was like lines on a zebra. At the end of the line, in the darkness, or, in other words, at the end of the line, Su Lu was holding a wine glass with both hands and chatting with the girl in the black dress with great interest. The people in the room were very curious. Who was this girl named Lulu? What was the relationship between her and Su Lu? How have you been recently? Sula looked into her eyes seriously and asked. Because of his attitude, Lulu felt very warm. She pursed her lips and said with a sweet smile, "Of course it's better to do it in the nightclub than in the Stars Club. It's just that the Westwoods is too far away from home, and it's hard to go home. Sometimes, I feel too bored. I didn't expect to see someone I know today." It was a small story from a long time ago. If it wasn't for the scandal of a national girl that all the media outlets in the Federation were hyping up last year, and the image of Su Lu wearing sunglasses appeared on TV many times, Lulu might not have remembered the cute and interesting boy from back then. It was also because of the TV news that she learned that the cute boy she met once was now a celebrity in the Federation. She was shocked and naturally paid more attention to his news. That was why she was able to recognize Su Lu at a glance under the psychedelic light tonight. At that time, she was very nervous, but still bravely stood up and recommended herself under the light. She didn't expect him to remember her, but for some reason, she had a faint desire. Unexpectedly, he actually recognized her. Yes, this beautiful girl in the black dress was Lulu, the girl that Su Lu met in the lounge of the club when he took Tai Ziyuan for a date. That story was too old and subtle. Other than leaving a legend of a chicken turning into a phoenix in Linhai's nightclub, it couldn't leave too many marks in the numb history of the nightclub. Ace Bai Chi became the mistress of a mysterious young man, and her sisters from back then still had to continue their lives of selling sex. Sula shouldn't have remembered, but he really didn't. Human memory was always a wonderful thing. Perhaps they would never meet again, but there would always be a few beautiful fragments left in the bottom of their hearts. That day when he woke up in the clubhouse, his fingertips touched the girl's soft thighs. This beautiful girl, who was younger than him but forced him to call her sister Lulu, wore pajamas and a pair of slippers, and insisted on painting her toenails next to him. With a hint of teasing, she kept seducing him. He also chatted with her and her in the clubhouse, playing cards and chatting with her in the clubhouse's room, bored and full of absurdity. These were all memories that were hard to forget. Sulu poured her a glass of wine. Looking at the girl who didn't age, but was even more beautiful, he couldn't help but sigh in his heart that didn't match his age. At that time, he was a poor concierge, and she was a girl in the clubhouse. Now, he was a famous person in the Federation, leading hundreds of people and holding many guns. She was still the same kind of girl, but she just changed her workplace. Time passed too quickly. A few years had passed in the blink of an eye, and the world had changed a lot. Tai Ziyuan, the lifeless prince, would probably never be the real, crazy teenager like he was back then. Lulu took a sip of wine and noticed the surprised expressions of the other people in the room. She couldn't help but feel nervous. She slightly looked up at Sula. From an ordinary girl in the clubhouse in Linhai City to a popular girl in the Golden Splendor nightclub, she must have been doing well these years. In fact, she was very beautiful back then, but she was too stubborn when she was young, so she couldn't stand out. Over the years, she gradually cut off the stubbornness of her youth, and her whole person seemed to be quieter and gentler. But it was unknown whether it was the appearance that had been tempered by the vicissitudes of life. This place is very formal, and the owner treats us well. We directly go to the second-level medical insurance, and we are responsible for a round trip every year. Lulu smiled and continued the previous topic. Probably because she felt like they had just met, she suppressed her nervousness and took the initiative to sit next to Sulu. However, she didn't want him to show a trace of sympathy for her, so she answered very seriously and pretended to be calm. Sulu himself was a mining orphan at the bottom of society. When he was young, he went to various sanatoriums with his uncle and was used to being teased by those sisters. How could he show sympathy for her? That's not bad. He answered very seriously, and then without hesitation, he told her his contact information. Lulu was obviously stunned by his actions. Didn't this young man know that they were on two different levels? Shouldn't he keep a distance from her to avoid trouble? Suli's tone was very serious, and his action of leaving his contact information was very natural. The girl was extremely warmed by his action of revealing his true nature. She raised her head and looked at him in a daze. After a long while, she came back to her senses. She lowered her head and poured a glass of wine to hide her true emotions. She asked sincerely in a low voice, "Can you tell me how Bai Chi is now?" Back then, Bai Chi was only an A-list prostitute in the clubhouse. She couldn't even be considered a high-class prostitute. After a night of sex, she became an official mistress of the Qianshirtai family. Although only a few people knew the true identity of her patron, she was already a legend in the Linhai entertainment scene. However, Lulu had always been worried about this sister of hers who had never been heard from again. Sulu heard the sincerity in her question and thought that this girl's temperament was really good. After pondering for a moment, he said with a smile, "As far as I know, she's doing very well." Because of his emotions, Sulu drank a few glasses of strong wine in a row. He was very drunk, but his stomach felt a little hungry. He really wanted to eat something. His right hand unnaturally wrapped around Lulu's soft waist. His fingertips touched the slightly warm smoothness through the thin fabric of her clothes. It was a little stiff. Lulu clearly felt the change in Su Li's mood and snickered in her heart. Then, she really felt a trace of shyness that she hadn't felt in a long time. She curiously raised her beautiful face and looked at his side profile seriously. She was looking forward to what would happen tonight. To be honest, she was really willing. It wasn't because the student back then had become a big shot, but because of the details tonight, the beautiful details. Sula noticed that the atmosphere in the private room was a little strange. The music was getting louder and louder, and the lights were getting blurry. However, the men and women in the room were sitting on the sofa with slightly uneasy expressions. A trace of embarrassment flashed across Lulu's face. She gently bit her plump red lips and whispered in his ear, "The topless costume should have been over a long time ago." Oh, when Su Lu was in the capital, he was often dragged to some high-class clubs by the seventh young masterly. He saw a lot of the charming and even obscene scenes of those small stars offstage. Although he had never really tasted meat, he was not unfamiliar with this situation. After a moment of silence, he knew that it was because he was in the private room that the team members were a little uneasy. He was even more unwilling to let Lulu stay here, although she was definitely not anyone to him. But when he thought of that kind of scene, his hidden male heart began to feel unhappy. He took Lulu's hand and stood up. He said to the people in the room, "We're going to eat supper. You guys have fun." The seven men were stunned for a moment. They stared blankly at Su Lu dragging the beautiful girl out of the room. When they saw the door was closed, they finally understood what had happened. In an instant, a burst of strong cheers broke out. Bai Yulan, who had been silently sitting in the shadows, pulled away the girl's hand that was on her thigh. She gave a few of the older team members a look. The team members in the hall of the nightclub watched Su Lu drag the girl out of the building. Under the influence of alcohol, they completely forgot the hatred and fear they had for this guy. One after another, they whistled excitedly. The whistling made Lulu shy like never before. Her cheeks suddenly turned red. It wasn't until they walked out of the nightclub and stood under the blue sky that the cool sea breeze in the distance woke her up a little. She knew that all this wasn't a dream. Although I know that at this time, it's best not to disturb you. But for your safety, we have to follow. Bai Yulan, Xiong Linquan, and a few others hurried out of the nightclub. She looked at Su Lu and said with a bitter smile, "No need." Su Lu smiled and shook his head. "We're going to eat supper." Everyone raised a middle finger in their hearts at the same time. Bai Yulan said calmly, "Don't forget the news that the Ministry of Defense and the Federation Bureau of Investigation sent last time. The two experts from Bermuda want to kill you. The Sunset State is their only chance. Lulu, who had been leaning against Su Lu like a docile little lamb, raised her head in surprise. She did not understand what they were talking about. Don't worry. The two experts haven't come to the Sunset State yet. When they arrive, I'll tell you. I believe that you, the real experts, won't just stand by and watch me be killed by them, Su Lu said with certainty. It was difficult for him to explain the source of his information to his subordinates. Under the cover of certain aristocratic families, the Federation Bureau of Investigation was unable to track down the two killers. However, he was the #1 target of protection under the Charter. The moment the Federal Central Computer received the alert, it began to comb through all the new chip signals that entered the border between the West Woods and Bermuda. Faced with such a huge amount of data flow, only the Central Computer, whose computing power was unimaginably terrifying, could make an accurate judgment by consuming a large amount of resources. In fact, in less than 2 days after the two experts from Bermuda entered the West Woods, all their tracks had been tracked down by the old man and then sent to Su Lu. The glory of the Charter was like a holy light behind Su Lu. Within the Federation, who could assassinate him? Bai Yulan was silent for a moment. She glanced at the girl beside him and said softly, "Be careful of your influence." 5 minutes later, Su Lu and Lulu arrived at a night market not far from the nightclub, hand in hand. Because the sea breeze was a little dry? Because they had seen too many deaths on the battlefield? Or perhaps it was because they had met a girl from the past on the front lines, far away from home. No one in the Sunset State would recognize him at night. He held the girl's hand without restraint. It was soft and very comfortable. In front of them was a large chrysanthemum garden by the sea. Therefore, this night market was called the Chrysanthemum Night Market. Sitting on a high stool beside the circular food tray, Su Lu didn't have time to gently stroke the girl's hair that was messed up by the sea breeze. His slightly narrowed eyes fell on the two sides. There were two groups of soldiers sitting on both sides of the night market. One group of soldiers was wearing light military uniforms without any insignia. They sat upright and had strict military discipline. They were the anti-government troops from Green Dragon Mountain who had come to the front lines of the West Woods to provide support. The other group of soldiers who were staring at the anti-government troops from Green Dragon Mountain with hostile eyes were from the 2nd Military Region. Chapter 477. There were chrysanthemums in the Chrysanthemum Night Market, and they were arranged next to the turntable. Su Lu was worried about the hidden emotions between the two groups of soldiers. The waiter calmly pushed over a dozen plates of food and 4 bottles of cold beer. Probably because he had seen too many dramas of soldiers in the night market, he was already used to it and wasn't nervous at all. Although the soldiers on both sides of the night market were brewing an angry atmosphere, they probably had misgivings about the military police all over Sunset Province, so they didn't make a move. Su Lu shook his head. He used the tip of his finger to scratch his slightly itchy eyebrows. He let go of the worry in his heart and opened the bottle of beer to pour a cup for Lulu. The golden liquid overflowed the cup with foam. Right now, they weren't in the luxurious room of the Golden Splendor nightclub. He and the girl were alone in the sea breeze, and for a moment, they couldn't find much to talk about. They were originally strangers, but they coincidentally met many years ago. Su Li's silence was because some of the troops were nervous. The smoke of the battlefield and the contract of life and death could arouse the instinctive desires of humans. It was probably because of the fear of death that the subconscious delayed the outbreak of lust. He was a normal young man, so on this cold night, he naturally had some expectations and excitement. Lulu was also secretly a bit nervous, but she also felt awkward because it was completely inconsistent with her profession. Thus, the two could only lower their heads and smile as they drank, chatting about the architectural style of Linhai Province. However, this was not something that Su Lu was good at, something that Miss Lulu would know. He didn't know how many glasses of beer had gone down his stomach, but the alcohol had gotten to his head. The girl beside him had become even more beautiful and alluring. Su Lu felt his face heat up. Just as he was about to say something, he suddenly heard a mocking voice coming from his right. "A bunch of bumpkins. Looks like you're really used to being poor in those crappy mountains." So many of you only order so little to eat. I say, you've already spent so much of our military funds. Why are you still pretending to be poor? The one who said this was an officer of the 2nd Military Region. Probably because he drank too much, he no longer had any scruples and vented all of the disdain and hatred in his heart. When they heard this extremely bitter ridicule, the Federation government soldiers began to roar with laughter. They provocatively shouted at the night market owner, saying that they wanted to add more food to the anti-government army. When the Green Dragon Mountain soldiers heard these noises, they angrily raised their heads and stared in that direction. Dressed in thin, light-colored military uniforms, they looked like a group of miscellaneous soldiers, but their discipline was really very strict. Although they were angry, they maintained absolute silence. However, it was this silence that suddenly erupted with a certain kind of aura, oppressing the entire night market inexplicably. Sula saw that Lulu was a bit nervous. Now, he explained to him, to the Federation's special force is now the Federation's first. Hearing his explanation, Lulu didn't feel relieved. The fear on her face became even stronger. After all, she was an ordinary girl living in S1. She had heard a lot of propaganda from the federal government since she was young. It was easy for her to associate the anti-government army with violent, bloody, and cruel words. Sulu remained silent. Today, the Federation was reconciled. President Pabre and Nanshue's leader held a historic handshake. The Green Dragon Mountain Anti-Government Army was reorganized into the 1st Special Force. However, no one knew when that crack in people's hearts would truly be erased. Even he himself often forgot the name of the 1st Special Force. He habitually called these soldiers the Anti-Government Army. The Green Dragon Mountain soldiers in the corner of the night market lowered their heads under the cold gaze of their commanding officer. They continued to quietly eat, from time to time picking up the water bottle beside them to drink a mouthful of water. Sula looked at the few plates of food on their table, as well as the cheap food on the plates. He felt a bit moved in his heart. He was moved by the other side's iron-like military discipline, as well as their unique temperament. That was a type of idealistic luster that could only be set off by simple and even poverty. But since it had already been reorganized, the Federation government wouldn't go so far as to cut off the other side's supplies. A trace of doubt flashed through Su Li's ink-black brows. He took out a military encrypted phone and dialed Shi Qinghai's number. No one answered the phone. The doubt between his ink-black brows turned into a bit of worry. Mr. Shi was nominated by Green Dragon Mountain and directly appointed by the president to be the liaison officer between the two sides. His position was extremely high. Could it be that he had to go on some dangerous mission? The Green Dragon Mountain soldiers had just returned from the front lines. Their bodies were covered in dust. They had just disembarked from the warship and were randomly looking for a place to fill their stomachs. Unexpectedly, they chose the Chrysanthemum Night Market, the place that soldiers love to gather. This group of simple and unadorned soldiers used the fastest speed to finish the food on their plates. The plates were very clean, and not a single grain of rice was wasted. They then prepared to line up and leave. It was clear that the Green Dragon Mountain troops had received strict instructions before coming to the front lines to avoid conflict with the government army as much as possible. The officer who didn't wear any Federation insignia walked up to the counter and took out a few bills to settle the bill. He said a few words to the waiter and then smiled and nodded his head to express his thanks. The subordinate soldiers knew that they had finished talking. They took out the water bottles beside them and walked up to the counter to begin lining up. In an extremely orderly manner, they collected water from the night market water purifier and filled the water bottles to the brim. Seeing this scene, Sulu was somewhat moved. He wasn't the only one who was moved. After a moment of silence, the soldiers of the 2nd Military Region watched as these Green Dragon Mountain soldiers prepared to leave. Their exceptionally intense emotions, stirred up by the alcohol, could no longer be controlled. I suddenly understand why these bumpkins who only know how to kill their own people are willing to spend money to come to this night market to eat. A major looked at the Green Dragon Mountain troops who were currently collecting water and said mockingly, "Do you guys understand? All the officers at the table shook their heads with disdain. Tonight, they had originally planned to invite a few of their comrades from the 3 military region to the Golden Splinter nightclub, but in the end, they couldn't enter. They had long been suppressing their anger. On the way, they just so happened to run into a lower-rank company, so the 100 or so people decided to just drink in the night market. Who would have thought that when they were drunk to the point of excitement, they would run into their mortal enemies? How could they let go of this opportunity to humiliate them? That major coldly laughed and said, "That's because these bastards are so poor that they don't have the money to find women, and they also don't have the qualifications to dance with the female members of the arts and crafts troupe. Now that they've joined us, they don't dare to forcefully snatch female students. This is so fucking sullen. They could only blow up their own people's chrysanthemums." Chrysanthemum night market? I think the barracks they live in are also called chrysanthemum barracks. As soon as these words were spoken, there was another wave of extremely unbridled laughter from the government army. The Green Dragon Mountain soldiers who were currently queuing up to collect water all raised their heads with a whoosh, staring at them angrily. Most of them couldn't keep their cool anymore after being provoked by these malicious words. They began to coldly roll up their thin military uniform sleeves, as if they were rolling up their martial force. In Sunset Province, it was very common for soldiers to fight after drinking. Seeing that the Green Dragon Mountain side seemed to be preparing to move, the government army soldiers didn't show any fear. They coldly stood up, gripping the ice-cold beer bottles on the table. That Green Dragon Mountain officer calmly waved his hand, suppressing the anger of his subordinates. After a moment of silence, he looked at the distant government army soldiers and said, "I will make a complaint about today's matter to the headquarters through the liaison office." "You're welcome to make a complaint, Officer Chrysanthemum. However, I advise you to put on the glorious epaulets of the Federal Army before you make a complaint. Since you've already joined us, then don't even think about keeping any face." That major of the 2nd Military Region said. The government soldiers behind him began to whistle, and countless obscenities spewed out. Sula was silent for a moment. He left his chair and turned to the group of government soldiers on his right. According to his temperament, if these people who deliberately stirred up trouble and disregarded the Federation's overall situation to humiliate Green Dragon Mountain were from other troops, he wouldn't have been able to restrain himself from flipping out long ago. Even though he was an important target of the federal military's nurturing, even though he didn't have the slightest good impression of Green Dragon Mountain's upper echelons, even though he had killed Macklin and punished the son of the Nanshui leader, because of his relationship with Zhang Xiaoming and Shi Qinghai, he emotionally couldn't accept the soldiers of Green Dragon Mountain being humiliated by others. However, the soldiers who humiliated Green Dragon Mountain were from the 2nd Military Region, so he could understand their anger. He quietly listened to this moment. For several decades, the Federation government had been encircling and suppressing Green Dragon Mountain's anti-government forces on S2. Who knew how many people had died from both sides? As the main force, the 2nd Military Region had formed a blood feud with Green Dragon Mountain's anti-government forces. These emotional soldiers of the 2nd Military Region, who were eager to fight, must have had their closest comrades and most respected superiors who had died under the bullets of Green Dragon Mountain's anti-government forces. How could such a grudge be resolved with a simple handshake from politicians? However, this matter was still too much. In the face of the invasion of the Empire, the Federation's general offensive was proceeding vigorously. However, in Sunset Province, a scene of brothers turning against each other was playing out. Sula couldn't accept it. He shouted at the government soldiers who were clenching their beer bottles tightly, as if they were about to rush out at any moment. "Enough! Do you want the military police to lock all of you up in a small darkroom?" However, he had only used force to deal with the old soldiers of the 7th Military Region. He hadn't personally dealt with a disturbance in the army. He didn't know that the soldiers, who were completely drunk, had naturally entered a state of excitement and preparation for a fight. They were just like the bulls on the electronic wall in Donglin that had been provoked by the uncle. As long as there was even the slightest touch, they would sensitively jump up. The soldiers in this type of state wouldn't care about verbal threats at all. On the contrary, They just happened to need a certain point to arouse the situation. The two sides confronting each other in the Chrysanthemum Night Market didn't know who he was. The dusky night and the pair of eyes that were red from alcohol made it impossible for them to see Su Li's face clearly. More importantly, the military uniform he wore tonight didn't have a lieutenant colonel epaulette. It was for the sake of being low-key, but it was also a source of trouble. Thus, it was quite regrettable that Su Li's appearance became that point. "Who the fuck are you?" That major of the 2nd Military Region released a drunken burp. He looked at him from the corner of his eyes. His gaze then passed over his shoulder and landed on that group of Green Dragon Mountain soldiers. His expression suddenly changed. He roared with extreme excitement. "Brothers, go!" What was going on wasn't a person, nor was it a bullet, but a beer bottle. The government soldiers, who had experience in street fights, roared and threw the beer bottles in their hands towards the Chrysanthemum Night Market. For a moment, the night sky of Sunset Province was filled with the sound of whistling wind and the muffled sounds of beer bottles smashing into people or the ground. A few beer bottles intentionally or unintentionally flew towards Su Li's body. His expression was extremely ugly as he turned around. He completely protected Lulu's body in his arms and allowed those bottles to smash into his back. Bang, 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 bang. It was as if the sound of drums could be heard. Chapter 478. Su Lu turned around and used his sturdy back to block the beer bottles that filled the sky. He just happened to see the Green Dragon Mountain troops being attacked, only to see countless beer bottles raining down. The place was already in a mess. The dining tables were flipped over and the beer bottles shattered on the ground. The glass shards that flew up were like shrapnel, extremely dangerous. That Green Dragon Mountain military officer coldly stared over there, completely ignoring those dangerous beer bottles that flew past his head. With a bang sound, a beer bottle smashed into his head, creating a bloody wound that was so deep that the bone could be seen. The military officer expressionlessly took a deep breath, wiping away the blood on his face. Suddenly breaking the silence, he pointed over there and roared, "Fight for me!" The equipment of the Green Dragon Mountain troops was far behind the government army. Even if the Federation's Ministry of Defense provided a lot of support, they still looked pitifully plain. However, their military training and discipline far surpassed the average level of the government army. When those ferocious beer bottles flew over, they either threw themselves to the ground or lifted up the dining tables. They were extremely proficient in dodging. At this moment, hearing their commanding officer finally give the order to fight, the Green Dragon Mountain soldiers whose eyes were already burning with fire began to loudly shout. They picked up the stainless steel kettles beside them and fiercely threw them towards the government army, beginning a courageous counterattack. Whoosh, whoosh. Several kettles whistled as they flew over. These kettles were not like beer bottles that could explode, but the stainless steel kettles that were filled with clear water were exceptionally heavy and sturdy, their momentum astonishing. Following, there were even more stainless steel kettles. The giant hail-like kettles pierced through the night sky, landing in the middle of the 2nd Military Region's troops. With muffled smashing sounds, they instantly smashed into many people, causing them to bleed and faint on the ground. The ground was filled with remnants of chrysanthemums and foam. The color of the beer was the same. The sky was filled with beer bottles and stainless steel kettles. The entire Chrysanthemum Night Market immediately sank into a dangerous, chaotic battle, the number of people bleeding more and more. Both sides hid behind their respective tables, howling in pain and cursing at the same time. They fought at close quarters, picking up any hard objects around them and throwing them at each other. The scene was extremely spectacular. The rest of the customers in the night market had scattered like birds and beasts when the two sides confronted each other. Su Lu tried to mediate, but was trapped in the middle. There was a possibility that he would be accidentally injured by flying objects at any time. Fortunately, when the battle started, the night market waiter on the turntable was quick to react. He pulled the two of them into the turntable and, at the same time, put a thick shield over their heads. From time to time, there would be heavy banging sounds on the board. Su Lu, who was frowning, held Lulu's hand and half-squatted under the board. He was a little flustered by these sounds. However, the night market attendant seemed to be relatively calm. He squatted in the corner and drew circles silently. Sula put down the phone and asked, "It looks like you're not that scared. We Sillin have a lot of soldiers, so we have the most mountains in the army. Going back a few decades, there are so many old grudges between the few military regions that we can't even count them. Every time we drink too much and have nothing to do, we'll start complaining bitterly about which army abandoned their allies on the battlefield back then, and how brave we were. How could we not fight?" The attendant said mockingly, "I heard the boss say that the Chrysanthemum Night Market has been open for as long as these soldiers have been fighting for. Especially since last year, when the Federation started to counterattack, more and more soldiers came, and the number of battles became more and more frequent. Look, last week, the 3rd Red Division in the West Woods even had a fight with a military region's special mecha team here. In the end, 3 ambulances even came." "That's really scary," Lulu said softly with a pale face. "What's so scary about it? When soldiers fight, they won't lay a hand on us commoners. Every time there's a loss, the officers of the army will naturally pay for it. All the facilities will be replaced every 2 to 3 weeks. The boss isn't that unhappy. As for us, we'll just treat it as a show." The male attendant said mockingly. He seemed to be indifferent, but in reality, his words were full of anger. After a moment, he scratched his head and said emotionally, "But a scene like today's is really rare. Fuck, hundreds of beer bottles flying in the sky. It's really fucking spectacular." As he said that, the baffle above them was hit by a heavy object. With a heavy thud, dust fell. "Hide! Hide! These bastards' kettles are too hard. Fuck you. Class 3, go to the warehouse and bring the stored beer bottles over. We don't have enough ammo. Save the kettles. There's not much left. Instructor, take people to the warehouse to get beer. Can't get beer? Get the charcoal for barbecue. 10:30 o'clock, 30 degrees inclination, 50 meters distance. Smash it." Countless angry roars and orders came from below the baffle. The soldiers on both sides of the conflict were using everything they could to make tactical movements for airstrikes and avoiding airstrikes. Beer bottles whizzed over, stainless steel kettles blasted over, and then rocks picked up from the beach, primitive barbecue charcoal that hadn't been completely burned. At this moment, the density of airstrikes in the Chrysanthemum Night Market was abnormally terrifying. There was even a legendary scene of beer bottles and stainless steel kettles colliding in the air and perishing together. The 3 people below the baffle looked at each other. Sula listened to these sounds and felt the chaos and danger outside. He felt like he wasn't in the West Woods main planet, Sunset State, but still on the front line of the battlefield on Fallen Star. Above his head were the missile planes of the Federation and the Empire. Everywhere was filled with the smell of burning leaves and mushroom-shaped smoke. The chaotic battle had already begun. The night market was full of dangerous objects in the airstrikes. At this moment, facing the soldiers who had lost their minds, Sula knew that he couldn't do anything. He helplessly took out a 37 brand cigarette and gave one to the male attendant. Lulu asked for one with trembling fingers. After lighting it up, she took a deep breath. Because of fear, her face became even paler. The 3 people crouched below the baffle and began to smoke silently. Just as he was about to finish a cigarette, the noise outside finally changed. It was a chaotic mess. Footsteps, the sound of fists hitting flesh, cries of pain, and curses were incessant. Only the loud sounds of beer bottles and kettles were hard to hear. The airstrike alarm was lifted. Sulu put out the cigarette and carefully lifted the baffle to look outside. The night market was already in chaos. The 2 sides that were attacking from afar had finally gathered together and started to fight in close range. Chairs were smashed into pieces, and cold iron pots were smashed into heads, causing blood to flow. Amidst the roars, the soldiers of the 2nd Military Region and the soldiers of the Green Dragon Mountain were entangled with each other in a fierce battle. Fortunately, the Federation's gun control was extremely strict. Even the frontline troops had to follow the rules and regulations of gun separation once they retreated to the main planet. Neither side carried a gun, so they could only vent their anger with their fists and feet. This fight looked tragic, but it shouldn't cause any deaths. Su Lu temporarily relaxed. However, the situation immediately changed again. The Chrysanthemum Night Market was located in the bustling area of Sunset State. All around it were troops resting and reorganizing. The news of this fight between the government army and Green Dragon Mountain spread extremely quickly. Countless soldiers who came to watch the show flocked to the night market. The spectators who did not know the truth were easily stirred up by the intense scene before them. Not to mention, the grudge between the government army and Green Dragon Mountain had not been completely settled. The first to join the fight was a group of soldiers from the 2nd Military Region who came after hearing the news. Then a logistics company from Green Dragon Mountain also joined the fight. Then, some soldiers from the 1st Military Region couldn't watch anymore and began to help a comrade in the trenches. A revolution was not a treat, but a fight really did feel like a treat. The two sides that were fighting fiercely in the night market did not shout and shout, but the passers-by excitedly joined in. The fight snowballed bigger and bigger, and the scene became even more chaotic. Every corner and space in the night market was filled with the shadows of fists and kicks. 2 versus 1 fight the landlord. 3 versus 1 was still fight the landlord, fighting until your head was broken and blood flowed. You could only look forward and not back. Both sides surrounded and blocked, cutting off the enemy's path of retreat. Sneak attacks, vicious attacks, blood flowing everywhere. The belt was not in the hands of the queen, only dancing in the night sky. Over 1,000 people fought in the night market. Countless pairs of feet crushed the golden chrysanthemums, and then crushed them together with the beer foam, glass shards, and mud on the ground, turning into some kind of indescribable mixture that splashed onto people's trousers and faces. Damn, this is really fucking spectacular. Su Li's head was still feeling tipsy. He groggily looked at this scene and said with incomparable shock. Then he thought, why hasn't the military police who received my call arrived yet? The chaotic battle in the night market was intense. The government army at the front lines always had a lot more people. Even if it was only the 2nd Military Region, they still had more people than Green Dragon Mountain. Not long after, the government army gradually gained the advantage and forced the other side to the northwest corner of the night market. The Green Dragon Mountain soldiers all had more or less injuries on their heads and bodies, but they were unwilling to admit defeat. They clenched their teeth and held on. The military police had not arrived yet, but the people of Group 7 had arrived first. When the members who were drinking and having fun in the Golden Resplendence heard that there was a big show happening not far away, no matter if it was the ruffian old members or the hedonistic and shameless new members, they all did not want to let go of this good opportunity to see a good show. They all excitedly rushed several dozen people over. The members of Group 7 were incomparably excited when they saw this scene. They did not care about the expressions of the people around them and began to frivolously whistle. They even began to cheer for both sides. But suddenly, someone remembered. Their manager seemed to have been drinking and drinking here before. Looking at the beer bottles on the ground in front of them, the night market was a mess, and there was not a single place that was undamaged. Everyone's expression changed, and they began to worry. Although they all knew that Su Li's battle prowess was extremely ferocious, with over 1,000 drunken soldiers causing trouble. Even if the war god himself was here, he would still have to avoid them. Who could really fight against 1,000 people? Xiong Linquan stared with wide eyes and searched for a long time, but he could not find any trace of Su Lu in this chaos. His phone call could not be connected either. His face immediately became as black as the bottom of a pot. Even someone as brave as him could not help but feel anxious when faced with this crazy night market brawl scene. He took a deep breath and painfully shouted, "Fuck!" Then he casually picked up a large iron pot in the mud by his feet, covered his head, and rushed into the night market. Chapter 479. We are here to look for someone. We are absolutely neutral. Don't accidentally hurt him. Because they were worried that their own supervisor, Su Lu, would be swallowed up by the sea of people, several dozen members of Group 7 gathered their courage and followed Xiong Linquan, who was spouting profanities, toward the center of the chaotic night market. Along the way, they picked up the small iron pots used for barbecuing that were scattered on the ground, or they picked up the table that was broken in two. They used them to block their heads and sides to protect themselves from the dangers that were everywhere. At the same time, they sincerely shouted out the words of self-defense like the one above. Right now, at the scene of the Chrysanthemum Night Market Brawl, the government army had already obtained a clear advantage. Those Green Dragon Mountain soldiers were suppressed to a corner of the night market. Group 7 squeezed out their sweaty bodies, accompanied by the slogan of not participating in the battle and a mess of protective equipment, actually successfully squeezed their way in. They approached the already messy food tray turntable that was full of octopus legs and mud. Beside the turntable, several government army officers were currently slapping the table, angrily commanding their subordinates to launch the final fierce attack on the Green Dragon Mountain soldiers that were still holed up in a corner but were still resisting with all their might. Their foreheads were still bleeding, clearly having suffered quite a bit in the previous chaotic battle. Xiong Linquan, who was wearing a large black pot, was sweating profusely. There were many muddy footprints on his body. While squeezing his way over, he still suffered a few kicks in the end. He moved close to the ear of a cursing officer and loudly said, "Brother, did you see our senior officer? Before you guys started fighting, he should have been drinking here." This officer's entire body reeked of alcohol, his tanned face completely red from anger and excitement. When he heard Xiong Linshuan's loud question, he angrily turned his head and roared, "What are you yelling for? Didn't you see that we are about to win? What did you see who?" Xiong Linquan couldn't find Su Lu, and his phone couldn't get through either. He was extremely worried, so how could he just let it go like this? He held onto his shoulder and said fawningly, "Brother, that is our senior officer. We don't dare let anything happen to him." Right at that time, there should be a beautiful girl by his side. The officer stared blankly for a moment, remembering the fellow who tried to calm the situation before. From his point of view, that guy's previous attitude was clearly biased towards the Azure Dragon Mountain, so he naturally wasn't in a good mood. He pulled Xiong Linshuan's hand down and used his hand to cover his forehead that was constantly bleeding. He cursed, "Fuck, it's that busybody. If I didn't know, he might have been beaten to a pulp. I say, get out of my way. If you provoke me, I'll beat you." Hearing this, Xiong Linshuan's expression changed slightly. The members of Group 7 behind him also glared at him. Over the past few years, Group 7 had made a name for itself in the West Woods for being ruthless. After disbanding for a year, Group 7 was reorganized and welcomed Su Lu, a manager who dared to go against Du Shaoqing. He was even more arrogant and domineering than before, and it was deeply ingrained in his bones. Regardless of whether it was the new or old members, no one would be willing to tolerate this kind of attitude. Yin Bingyan glared with his bulging eyes. His arm, which was as thick as a tree trunk, stiffened as he raised his fist, which was as big as a bullet, and prepared to smash it. As the face of the 17th Division, he was extremely tall and sturdy. Now that he suddenly went berserk, his aura was extremely frightening. Unexpectedly, the moment he moved his fist, he was hugged by Xiong Linquan. Xiong Linquan was half a head shorter than him, but his strength was greater than his. "What? You want to go berserk?" That officer spat on the ground and cursed, "Fuck, you really think that I don't dare to beat up all of you? Fucking mercenaries." As old foxes in the army, they could easily determine the allegiance of the other party through their military uniform, epaulets, and aura. If it was in the past, Xiong Linquan would have long sent this officer in front of him flying with a kick. But right now, he only tightly hugged Yin Bingyan, not letting him do anything. At the same time, he used his fierce gaze to suppress his restless subordinates. Right now, the situation in the Chrysanthemum Night Market was too chaotic. Everywhere were soldiers who had been stimulated by alcohol and blood to the point of near insanity. Although Group 7 was not afraid of fighting, their numbers were not small. More importantly, today's brawl involved Green Dragon Mountain. As an old member of Group 7, at this moment, Xiong Linquan calmly thought that if he and the others also participated in this brawl, perhaps it would bring some political trouble to Su Lu. Right now, They had a black pot on their heads, but that did not mean that they really wanted to be the scapegoat. The most intense area of the brawl had already moved to a corner of the night market. The soldiers of Green Dragon Mountain clenched their teeth, unwilling to disperse or admit defeat. Their desperate postures stimulated the atmosphere of the scene to the extreme. Everyone involved gradually lost their last bit of rationality. Their eyes were red from killing, and from time to time, there would be miserable groans. Sulu, who was squatting under the turntable, had already anxiously finished smoking 2 cigarettes. He watched the two sides of the brawl through the cracks. Some people began to pick up the sharp and broken beer bottles on the ground. He even saw that the weapons in the hands of some soldiers had traces of blood on them. He knew that the development of the situation had already spiraled out of control. He feared that before the military police arrived, someone would die. If an irresolvable and vicious conflict really did occur between the government army and Green Dragon Mountain, under the manipulation of certain people, it might affect the rare great reconciliation situation of the Federation. The ice-cold edge of the blade would be pointed at President Pabre and the high officials beside him. Moreover, it would definitely affect the military's victorious military operations against the Empire. Sulu understood the balance between politics and the interests of the Federation on a large scale. However, the direct reason why he made such a risky decision and rushed to quell the situation first was only the blood in the night market and the possibility of death at any time. Regardless of the difference in ideology and political philosophy, regardless of how much blood was shed in the 4 states surrounded by S2, in the Westwoods region, in the moment of war with the Empire, he believed that everyone's blood should flow on the front lines and should not dry up in the infighting and old grudges. After telling Lulu to stay under the turntable obediently with the waiter, Sulu crawled out from under the turntable. His whole body trembled, and like a loach, he slipped past the excited and twisted faces of the soldiers. He arrived in front of Xiong Linquan and said in a deep voice, "Give me the gun." Xiong Linquan and his team members looked at him with surprise and excitement. They didn't know where he came from, but he didn't have a single injury on his body. Just as they were about to go up and pat him on the shoulder and leave, they suddenly heard these words and didn't react for a moment. The Federation strictly controlled firearms, and the army was no exception. In the entire Group 7, only Xiong Linquan, who loved guns as much as his life, had exchanged his military merits for a high-authority gun permit. He carried a gun on him at all times. Sula knew this. With a calm face, he reached out his hand and directly took out a gun from Xiong Linquan's clothes. The slightly hot gun was a bit light in his hand. He frowned and looked down. He found that the gun was a green star, with an electric pulse and a liquid core at the back of the cartridge. The voice is a bit low. I'm afraid not many people can hear it. He thought in his heart and stuffed the green star back into Xiong Linquan's hand. Without any hesitation, he touched the gun again and found an H01 pistol. Finally satisfied, he held it tightly and walked toward the several officers of the government army. Xiong Linquan and his team members were stunned. They didn't know what he was going to do. Sulu walked in front of the several officers. Looking at their violent expressions, his heart sank. It was a nearly impossible task to calm nearly 1,000 soldiers who were driven crazy by violence and blood. You have already won. The military police will be here soon. Tell your people to stop. The leaders of the 2nd Military Region glanced at him and cursed, "Get out of my way." Sulu saw the blood and fighting on the other side. Without a moment of hesitation, he raised the pistol to the night sky and pulled the trigger continuously. Bang! 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 The H01 was the first generation of the H21. It also had a very long magazine, but it had the simplest mechanical firing pin design. The gunshot was exceptionally loud. He stared at the several officers of the government army and fired continuously into the sky with no expression on his face. His forearm kept trembling slightly, and the gun barrel spewed out beautiful gunfire. The crisp gunshot resounded throughout the chaotic night market, and then continued to rise, penetrating through countless environmental noises and clearly shaking everyone's eardrums. Soldiers were the most sensitive to the sound of guns. The sudden series of crisp gunshots in the night market made them, who were fighting and roaring, subconsciously stopped their movements at the same time. The beer bottle that was poking forward froze in the air, and the military boots that were kicking towards each other's abdomen lost most of their strength. At this moment, the uncontrollable chaos finally had an extremely precious moment of silence in the chaos of the night market. Many people from both sides started to look for the source of the gunshots. The people around Sulu clearly saw this scene, and they all rushed over. Sulu lowered his raised right hand, and in the midst of the smoke coming out of the gun barrel, he said to the officers in front of him expressionlessly, "Order your people to stop immediately." The members of Group 7 who squeezed into the night market saw this scene and felt the hostile gazes of countless people around them. With their eyes wide open, they rushed behind Sulu and stared fiercely at the surroundings, tried to intimidate the attacks that could erupt at any time toward Sulu. Because of the gun control, the soldiers in the night market basically didn't have any guns on them. However, the officer of the 2nd Military Region, whose forehead was bleeding, stared coldly at Sulu. He slowly pulled open a corner of his military uniform, revealing his gun holster, and said, "I also have a gun, but I haven't used it yet." The officer slowly took out his gun, scratched his forehead that was a little itchy from the stimulation of the blood, and looked at Sulu with disdain. They said to the officer, "So you should know very well what it means to use a gun in a fight." In a group fight, using guns was a big taboo. This was the rule in the military for countless years. First, it was easy to kill with guns, and second, it was related to the dignity of a soldier. Sulu obviously knew this, but the problem was that in today's situation, if he didn't use his gun, there would definitely be people who would die. He wouldn't solve anything with this officer and the hostile government soldiers around him. He stepped forward, reached out, and twisted the officer's wrist. The tip of his elbow heavily hit the officer's armpit, and his left hand slid down from his wrist like a chain, easily snatching the gun, and then pointed the cold muzzle at the officer's forehead. Chapter 480. There were cries of alarm all around. Not a single person in the night market was able to clearly see what Sulu did to actually disarm him so easily. As a soldier, to have his gun taken away by someone empty-handed was an unparalleled humiliation. Moreover, the person who had his gun taken away was their commanding officer. The soldiers' shock immediately turned into boundless anger as they once again pressed forward. The members of Group 7 surrounding Sulu immediately felt the pressure become unbearable. Their expressions began to tense up. That officer was struck in the armpit by Sulu. He painfully covered his mouth and coughed a few times. However, he immediately straightened his body. His expression was extremely ugly as he stared at Sulu. With a voice that chilled to the bottom of one's bones, he said, "If you have the fucking guts, then kill me." Saying this officer valiantly took a step forward. Using the space between his eyebrows, he fiercely jabbed the barrel of the gun in Sulu's hand. "Don't worry about these guys. Brothers, let's first beat those mountain bumpkins to the ground. Then we'll take care of these mercenaries who sell their lives for money." The valiant officer looked at Sulu with ridicule in his eyes. He loudly cursed. "I want to see who the fuck dares to open fire today." Good. The situation that had already calmed down temporarily became even more agitated because of this officer's hot-blooded declaration. The government soldiers picked up their weapons and prepared to charge in that direction again. Meanwhile, the Green Dragon Mountain soldiers who were gasping for breath had no choice but to pick up the weapons beside them again. The soldiers completely ignored Sulu, who was holding a gun. With a whoosh, the crowd surged forward like a tide. Sulu slightly raised the H-01 pistol in his right hand. Without hesitation, he pulled the trigger. With a whoosh, a bullet shot out. It brushed past the toes of the fastest charging soldier and shot into the ground of the night market. A wisp of green smoke rose. The soldiers who bravely charged into the battle with their weapons clearly did not have the slightest bit of mental preparation for this shot. Although Sulu's shot was 3 inches in front of his feet, the crisp sound of the gunshot and the dirt and smoke that sprayed out from the point of impact still shocked everyone on the spot. The other party actually dared to open fire. Moreover, He did it so cleanly without any hesitation. Where did he get the courage to do so? The sea of people paused for a second. Suddenly, a few extremely dangerous curses rang out from the crowd. We have dozens of people. He only has a few bullets. Brothers, go. The current situation was still dangerous, to the extent where it was even more tense than before. It was just that the focus of the crowd's unconscious violent emotions had shifted from the Green Dragon Mountain troops to Sulu, as well as the several dozen group 7 members behind him. Under the influence of alcohol, the soldiers who had fallen into a certain kind of crazy state of mind did not completely disregard life and death, but it was indeed difficult for them to rationally think about what would happen if they accidentally fired. More importantly, the soldiers did not believe that Sulu would dare to shoot at them. The crowd began to become restless. However, at this time, the expressions of several officers changed drastically. They blocked in front of the crowd and spread out their arms, not allowing the crowd to touch a single hair on Su Li's head. Tonight, the guests of the 2nd Military Region's banquet were these officers. They came from the highly anticipated Iron 7 Division. Relying on their illustrious military achievements on the front lines of the West Woods and the publicity of the Federation, they enjoyed extremely high prestige within the government army. No one would have thought that at this moment they would take the initiative to stand up. Although the soldiers did not know why they did this, they subconsciously slowed down their footsteps and watched the scene in front of them with puzzlement and hiccups. Sulu was now a celebrity in the Federation. However, thanks to the protection of the pair of sunglasses and the fact that he had never been interviewed by the media, even in the currently popular documentary Team 7, he had never shown his real face. Therefore, not many people could connect this simple and calm face at the scene of the night market fight with this legendary figure. However, the officers of the Iron 7 Division had seen him before. During the graduation drill at the training base, during the sniper operation at the Yellow Mountain Ridge on Planet 5460, this face had left a deep impression on them. It was a face that was too complicated for them to bear. As direct subordinates of Du Shaoqing, they should have hated Su Lu very much. However, every time they thought of the black MX flying like a bullet in the valley, they felt a sense of closeness and gratitude in their hearts. However, the reason they stopped the restless soldiers was not to protect Su Li's safety. It was because they knew very well the true temperament of this young lieutenant colonel under his calm appearance. If these soldiers really dared to continue charging, this guy would really dare to shoot. At this time, the situation was slightly better. The sounds of fighting and cries of pain gradually subsided. However, the officer whose forehead was pointed at by Su Lu still stubbornly held his head high and looked at him with disdain. He was not moved by the sudden calm behind him. It seems that you're the highest-ranking officer here. I want you to order them to stop immediately, back off, and wait for the military police to investigate. Su Lu lowered the barrel of his gun slightly and said calmly, "My brother died in Green Dragon Mountain." The officer said coldly, "But I don't want to explain anything to you mercenaries. You only need to know that I am a major. I should be the one giving you orders, not the other way around. I am a lieutenant colonel," Su Lu replied. The officer's expression changed slightly, but he still stubbornly refused to make any concessions. Su Li's face became slightly pale. His eyes narrowed out of habit, a stream of cool radiance flitting past. The current situation was extremely delicate. If he took a step back, he might be able to open up the sea and open the sky, but the night market definitely wouldn't be peaceful. No one could guarantee that the restless soldiers would clean up the Green Dragon Mountain troops that were already swaying left and right. This wasn't the front lines, but it was close to the front lines. Su Lu silently thought to himself. His 2 thumbs pulled open the spring buckle on his pistol. Taking half a step back, he turned his body and aimed at this officer. Without any hesitation, he pulled the trigger. Pu-pu-pu. A series of concentrated and crisp gunshots rang out. Thick smoke and misty flames accompanied by a unique smell pervaded the space between the 2 people. The bullets sliced past, creating a series of sizzling noises. The unmanned turntable behind the officer was riddled with holes. Countless wood shavings flew into the air. Occasionally, shrapnel would strike metal objects, creating dang-dang sounds and light chirping sounds. It was unknown where it flew off to. Countless bullet points accompanied fine dust, appearing before everyone's eyes like a scene that could only be seen in movies. The stupefied soldiers stared at this scene in shock. Only when the gunshots stopped did they react. Their bloodshot eyes widened, as if they were going to split apart. They began to shout loudly in anger, fear, and grief. The light smoke released from the gun barrels scattered. The soldiers who were preparing to pounce over and tear Sulu into countless pieces of minced meat discovered that their officer was still standing in his original position, completely unharmed. He stood in the middle of countless bullet holes. Only, his face was pale, as if he had just died. Sulu silently walked up. He raised the two pistols and pressed them against the officer's chest and neck. He forcefully pushed the officer against the turntable, creating a muffled boom sound. Amidst the sizzling sounds, the scalding hot gun barrels burned the officer's clothes, burning a circle of skin under his neck. The officer let out a muffled groan. His brows were tightly furrowed, but he did not cry out in pain. It was unknown whether he was stunned by the flurry of gunfire or because of some other reason. Sulu gazed at the face that was inches away from him and said, "I don't want to hear the story of the grudges between you and Green Dragon Mountain. After the people of the Empire are chased out of the Federation, it's your business how you want to take revenge. But before that, it's best if you keep your head clear." The officer's lips trembled, but he did not speak. "You should know very well how many bullets are left in these two guns. So, you must not overestimate my patience and rationality. I have never dealt with a commotion like this before. If you really push me into a corner, I'm willing to do all sorts of crazy things." Sulu finally said, "I know how ruthless you are, but you don't know how ruthless I am." The expression on the officer's face twitched slightly. He let out two hoarse laughs that sounded like he was crying. Then he lowered his head and was silent for a few seconds. He extended his right hand that had been cut by the wooden stubble and was dripping with blood. He waved at the crowd around him. When the soldiers in the night market saw this scene, they subconsciously and slowly put down the beer bottles and bayonets in their hands. Extremely complicated emotions appeared on their faces. The military police had not yet arrived. Sulu did not let go of the gun in his hand. Xiong Lin Quan and his team members stood behind him, vigilantly watching the surroundings. The officers of the Iron 7th Division also began to help maintain order. The night market gradually calmed down. The soldiers who had participated in the gang fight stood rooted to the ground like wooden puppets. Regarding the identity of the mercenary manager who had appeared out of nowhere and dared to shoot between the government forces in Green Dragon Mountain, there was a guess, or rather, a piece of information that gradually spread through the crowd. From time to time, whispers could be heard. "It's the 7th Division. Then this is Sulu." 3 minutes later, the mournful sound of a military vehicle alarm from the West Woods Military Police Headquarters finally rang out outside the night market. "Why were you there? Shooting in the middle of the street. Do you know which military discipline this violated?" Regarding what happened tonight, first write a description of the situation. After the investigation team is formed tomorrow, I hope you can honestly answer your own questions. "What's your name?" "Sulu." "Huh. Lieutenant Colonel Sulu." "Salute." In the dark interrogation room of the West Woods Military Police Headquarters, the officers of the relevant departments were investigating the gang fight that night. Thus, there was a series of interrogations in front of them. What was very strange was that those cold and oppressive questions, when the officers saw Su Li's name, suddenly turned into shocked exclamations of disbelief. They subconsciously stood at attention and saluted the youngest lieutenant colonel of the Federation behind the table. Sulu looked at this scene and thought that if he had worn the epaulette today, would have been easier to deal with the chrysanthemum night market incident. What followed was a routine explanation of the situation and the recording of the witness testimony. However, the attitude of the military police officers at this time became much gentler. It didn't take long for this work to be successfully completed with Su Li's cooperation. "Lieutenant Colonel, I'm very sorry, because this incident has too many implications, and people from all three military regions participated in the fight. We are also under a lot of pressure, so you can't return to camp for the time being. You may have to wait until tomorrow for the investigation team to formally question you before you can leave the military police headquarters. No problem. We have arranged a lounge for you. Please follow me. Sulu followed an officer out of the door and walked upstairs. After asking, he found out that Xiong Linquan and his team members were resting on the third floor and hadn't been punished, so he was relieved. However, he didn't expect that the girl named Lulu would also follow. The sound of footsteps was particularly clear in the dark military police headquarters building. When he walked past the door, he suddenly heard a somewhat familiar voice coming from behind the door. At this time, that voice was cursing. Immediately after, there were countless voices full of cursing behind the door. This is the conference room. Right now, sitting inside are the officers of the various military units who participated in the fight. The military police officer said with a self-deprecating smile, "They came to get people. Speaking of which, every one of them is a famous war hero." Encountering such people, the military police headquarters didn't dare to be too tough, so they could only let them hit the table. Chapter 481. No one died from the night market brawl, but many people from both sides were seriously injured and sent to the hospital. Since the matter was so big, the West Woods Military Police Headquarters naturally launched an investigation extremely quickly. However, in response to this, the officers from various troops who came to the military police headquarters to rescue people or create a ruckus also arrived extremely quickly. The chaotic battle in the Chrysanthemum Night Market could not be sorted out for now. Just how many troops were involved, but from the noise of the people in the meeting room, it must have involved a lot of people. Other than the soldiers from both sides who were lying in the hospital, the rest of the people were all locked up in the military police department and a few temporary detention centers not far away. The government troops and Green Dragon Mountain troops were all under separate custody. Sulu stood outside the meeting room and listened silently. He originally thought that something had happened to the people of Green Dragon Mountain on the front lines, and as the liaison officer, Shi Qinghai would come to deal with it. However, this somewhat familiar voice clearly did not belong to the hooligan young master. Who could it be? Fuck, I don't care so much. I only know that my people are still lying in the hospital right now, and there's still people locked up by you. Where are you going to release them? You have to give me a definite answer. In the meeting room, an officer around 30 years old had a ruthless expression. He stared at the military police headquarters reception officer and slammed the hardwood long table with a bang. Except my ass. Which night in Sunset State doesn't have dozens of fights? Does your military police headquarters have to send dozens of military vehicles to rescue people every time? Another officer sat by his side and stared at the military police headquarters officer with full anger. He took off his smelly military boots and slammed the table with force. He loudly said, "Didn't we just beat up a few monkeys in a mountain? Is there a need to make it like this?" "Exactly," the officer from before said with a gloomy face. "What political influence do you care about? I don't care. I just want to take my people back. The day after tomorrow, our regiment is going to go to 3320, but you fucking locked up my electrical control officer. How do you want me to fight? Be blind? If we lose and people die, who's going to take responsibility? Do you have the right to take responsibility?" The third officer calmly continued to exert pressure on the military police headquarters. This is a problem between the 2nd Military Region and Green Dragon Mountain to begin with. What does it have to do with our Hui Ming fleet? The 4 military officers who were caught by you were just on a normal vacation. They left Changfeng Base and saw the bustling night market. Therefore, they were caught by you. Is there any justice in this? If you don't let them go, the warships won't be able to move. How will the Federation send soldiers to the front lines? Hearing this, the officer who scolded the most fiercely at the beginning frowned and glared angrily. His name was He Lei, the commander of the 11th Automated Corps of the 2nd Military Region. He held the rank of lieutenant colonel and was the highest among the dozen or so officers present. However, the main force of the night market brawl was his subordinates. Now, More than 200 of them were detained by the West Woods Military Police Headquarters. He had no choice but to come and rescue them. He was already embarrassed and angry. Now that he heard these words, he could not help but feel even more annoyed. He remembered that when he was in class back then, Mizaru was such a sinister and shameless rabbit. The chief of the West Woods Military Police Headquarters, who was in charge of receiving the officers, had a very bad expression. He looked at the major of the federal fleet and thought, if your subordinates were really just watching, why would they be bruised and covered in blood? Although he thought so, the chief did not dare to ridicule the officers in the conference room, especially the ones who made the most trouble. These people were the mid-level, powerful officers that the federal military focused on cultivating. They had made outstanding military achievements in the military operations in the past few months and had grown into famous war heroes. At this time, the reason why these officers were far away from the front lines and appeared in Sunset State to rescue people for their respective troops was that they were going to participate in the frontline award ceremony in 3 days. How could the military police headquarters easily offend such people? Seeing that the section chief had no reaction, Lieutenant Colonel Healy was furious. He slammed the table and said loudly, I've already given enough face to the military police headquarters by not asking you to hand over the person since the monkeys of Green Dragon Mountain have already been beaten up badly. But if you still don't let him go, don't blame me for being reckless. Hearing this, the chief of the military police headquarters frowned and was about to reprimand him when he suddenly saw the officer beside him. He immediately shut up and thought, you're familiar with them, so the headquarters urgently transferred you over to pacify them. Now is the time for you to take the field. Hua Xiaoxi was now the vice captain of a mecha brigade in the West Woods Military Police Headquarters. This time, he had returned to the main planet to rest and reorganize because he was going to participate in the award ceremony in 3 days. Who would have thought that when he was drinking soup at home, he would receive a call from a superior telling him to rush to the military police headquarters? Confused, he listened in the conference room for a long time before finally understanding the general situation. Although he did not understand the details, he could not listen any further. He looked at Healy and said angrily, Enough, old he. The people from Green Dragon Mountain all had broken bones because of you. 2 of them are still lying in the medical cabin. You want to take your people away? How is that possible? What's the use of you making a ruckus in the military police headquarters? You have to at least give me some face, right? Hua Xiaoxi, I'm only slowly chatting with these military police officers because we're classmates. Lieutenant Colonel Healy looked at him coldly and said, If this was somewhere else, I would have just dragged a regiment over and taken down this fucking military police building. Hua Xiaoxi's expression changed slightly. He was so angry that he laughed and said sharply, Yes, who are you? You've already been promoted to regiment commander, Lieutenant Colonel. You've already caught up with the instructors, but you have the right to compete with me. Go. I'd like to see if you, the regiment commander, have the guts to drag your regiment over. But I still have to tell you that if your regiment wants to take down the military police building, I'm afraid it will be too difficult. Is that so? Hua Xiaoxi, don't think that just because the West Woods is your home ground, you could be so impudent in front of me. Healy narrowed his eyes and looked at him. He slapped the table and said rudely, I'm your squad leader. Don't fucking forget. Hua Xiaoxi's words stopped. His face was dark with anger, but he couldn't make any rebuttal to this sentence. After holding in for a long time, he squeezed out a sentence from between his teeth. I'll tell you the truth. Before the investigation is clear, it's impossible to let them go. The officer who had been hitting the table with his smelly military boots suddenly jumped up when he heard this. He pointed at Hua Xiaoxi's nose and scolded. Which side are you on? Our military region has never treated the West Woods military region as an outsider. My people are all experts in missile positioning and calculation. If you catch them, what will happen to the front line? Most of the people over there are from the West Woods. Hua Xiaoxi glared at this thin and small officer. He wasn't afraid of him at all. He slapped the table and shouted back in an even louder voice. You still have a nerve to say that? A few dignified professors from the Research Institute of Mechanization and Automation are fighting in the night market like fucking hooligans. Lin AI, you're also a talented student. Look at how you're holding your smelly shoes. What kind of shit have you fallen into? No wonder your subordinates are all fucking hooligans with high IQ but low EQ. With a buzz, the entire conference room was in an uproar again. The future of the federal military and the outstanding young officers no longer cared about face or manners. They slapped the table and scolded their mothers, smashed their teacups, and scolded their fathers. Their obscenities shook the glass windows nonstop. This kind of high-spirited and fierce mood made the officers of the other troops also become agitated and join in the scolding battle. If you don't give us an explanation for this matter, we'll beat up those monkeys from Green Dragon Mountain every time we see them in the future. Count me in. I've long found those bumpkins an eyesore. Let them go. Let them go immediately. Severely punish those Green Dragon Mountain villains. And what's the background of that group of mercenaries? Fucking hell, they actually dared to shoot at my people. Let's not talk about anything else. You have to hand that guy over first. The tightly shut door of the meeting room was suddenly pushed open. Su Lu walked straight in under the astonished gazes of the Silan officers behind him. His small eyes had long since narrowed into a line, or perhaps it would be better to say that they were a ray of light from a blade. His face was completely dark and extremely ugly. I was the one who opened fire in the night market. How do you want to deal with me? The conference room was suddenly in chaos and then gradually quieted down. Only the staff officer that Commander He brought along was still angrily scolding. This person was incomparably angry about what happened to his comrades. When he suddenly realized that Su Lu had pushed open the door and walked in, admitting to what had happened, he glared at him and pointed at his nose and roared, "So it's you, kid? You got guts to actually stand up. See how I'll cut you to pieces." After saying this, the staff officer suddenly felt that the environment around him was a little strange. He turned around in shock and saw that the conference room was deathly silent. The cigarette in his commander's mouth fell onto his military uniform, and a hint of fear flashed across his face. As for the officers who had been the most aggressive earlier, they began to use their trembling hands to fasten the collar buttons that they had undone after scolding him earlier. This strange scene made the staff officer's body a little stiff. His arm that was still pointing at Su Li's nose suddenly became much heavier. Commander He slapped the back of his head fiercely. Then, in a fluster, he slapped away the burning cigarette but on his military uniform and quickly pushed his chair away to stand up. Miss Lin AI, Hua Xiaoxi, and a few other young officers also hurriedly stood up. With unconcealable expressions of shock, they jogged in front of Su Lu. After the hurried formation was completed, Commander He looked ahead and shouted loudly, "Salute!" With a whoosh, the officers collectively stood at attention. Their posture was impeccable. They raised their right hands in unison and saluted Su Lu. Then they shouted loudly, "Good morning, instructor." Tom seemed to have returned to 10 months ago. In that secret training base of S1 in class, in the middle of the mecha training field, when class monitor He shouted, all the officers in the class saluted in unison. The iron-blooded instructor Tetrahue, who wore large sunglasses, nodded coldly. Only then did everyone dare sit down. Su Li's eyes narrowed slightly. His expression was as cold as a block of black ice. He was originally a person as gentle as the spring sun. Even when he was dealing with that bunch of old soldiers from Group 7, he mainly acted in silence. But for some reason, when facing this batch of officer students with the most potential in the Federation, he was able to naturally put on an extremely cold expression. Perhaps it was because he was used to being their instructor and subconsciously wanted to maintain some sort of dignity as a teacher. The other officers in the meeting room who didn't know the inside story were all stunned. They didn't understand what had happened, but they could clearly feel the respect that He and the others had for this young officer from the bottom of their hearts, and even fear. Su Lu didn't nod, so He, Hua Xiaoxi, and the others didn't dare to disperse. They stood at attention and looked straight ahead. However, beads of sweat were dripping down their foreheads. Chapter 482. At the turn of spring and summer of the 68th year of the constitutional calendar, in the first 2 to 3 months of the training base, the sunglasses-wearing instructor Su Lu and the arrogant officer students in class had been filled with hostility. The relationship between the two was not harmonious at all. As Su Lu gradually displayed his level of knowledge in the field of mecha at the base and displayed astonishing close combat ability in a battle with 2 officers of the Iron 7th Division on the field, this relationship slowly began to change. It was only at the farewell dinner before graduation that the officers took turns coming forward to propose a toast to Su Lu, and only then was the relationship between them truly confirmed as a teacher-student. If that was all, when they met on the battlefield in the future, these echelon officers whom the Federation had focused on grooming would probably only nod and salute him. They would not show him the respect they were showing him now. But in the days that followed, the officer-students gradually discovered that this young lieutenant colonel was actually the strongest person in the Federation mecha, the one who had defeated Madman Lee on the summit of Cocky Peak, and the one who had been personally recruited by the Lord Marshal, successfully developing the MX mecha, overthrowing the Dean of the Academy of Science, rumored to be related to Macklin's death, the future son-in-law of the Minister of Defense, the subject of some shady scandal involving Jianshur. All in all, Su Lu had already shone brightly in the Federation. His background and experience were already more than enough reasons for the officer students to admire him. But admiration was not respect, and it was definitely not reverence. The officers admired and respected him until they finally feared him from the bottom of their hearts. The real crux of the matter was the graduation day drill. That day, Su Lu had stood in front of the officer students who had been humiliated as trash, staring straight at Du Shaoqing, forcing this famous Federation general and iron-blooded division commander to hold his temper. He had led everyone in a battle in the early morning drill at Lonely Ridge, and in the end had broken through the camp with ease, allowing everyone's pride to continue. After this battle, no matter how proud and conceited the trainees were, once they faced Drill Master Su Lu, they would all become honest students. They didn't even dare to breathe loudly. This was probably the so-called dignity of a teacher that emanated from the heart. They were used to the instructor's sarcastic and vicious verbal attacks in class and his powerful attacks on the training field. When they thought about how they had scolded the instructor in the conference room earlier, everyone's sweat dripped down like rain, seeping through the motionless dark military uniforms. They were like frozen cicadas that suddenly entered midsummer, but they did not dare to move at all, just like when they were at the training base. Go my ass. Su Lu looked at the officers in front of him with a sullen face and scolded. I fired a shot and was about to be cut to death. How can I get better? As soon as he said this, he lay and the other officers let out a sigh of relief. They spread out in 2 rows and opened up a path. At the same time, they moved a chair and placed it in front of the long table. When Su Lu walked past Hilay, he suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Who is the monkey?" Hilay stood ramrod straight and did not dare to make a sound. Although he was now a lieutenant colonel, and his military rank was equal to Su Li's and his authority was far above Su Li's, when the instructor was scolding him, how could he dare to refute? Su Lu paused in front of Lin AI again and asked seriously, "Who is the bumpkin?" Lin AI looked down with an extremely serious and solemn expression. It was as if the obscenities from before had definitely not come from the mouth of a senior technical officer like him. Mizuru puffed out his chest and nervously waited for the instructor to question him. Unexpectedly, Su Lu walked right past him and sat down. He couldn't help but exhale softly with some lingering fear. Behind the 3 of them, Hua Xiaoxi, who had not participated in this matter, smiled slightly. She looked like she didn't care at all, but in reality, she was rejoicing in their misfortune. After everyone sat down, the atmosphere in the conference room became a little strange. Not everyone in the room knew Su Li's identity, but seeing the few most arrogant officers in the army turn into rabbits in front of this young man, they naturally didn't dare to say anything. They nervously listened to Su Li's lecture while secretly guessing Su Li's identity and background. Bumpkin? Monkey? That's the special forces, your comrades, Su Lu said. How many people did Green Dragon Mountain send to lay the net on the 3 fallen stars? How many of their people died? They are also fighting and sacrificing for the Federation. Are they only worthy of you using such descriptions to humiliate them behind their backs? Not completely sober, Su Li's voice was a little hoarse. However, when he thought of the group brawl in the night market and the argument he had heard outside the conference room, his mood became a little heavy. The Empire's great enemy was right in front of them, but there were still so many disputes within the Federation. The president had spent a great deal of effort and political courage to create the social foundation for great reconciliation, but within the army, this foundation was clearly too fragile. I don't know much about politics, but I do know some very simple principles. On the battlefield, if you want to believe in your comrades, you must first respect your comrades. He and the others exchanged glances. They thought to themselves, is the instructor preparing to start a political class right away? They quickly sat down and took out their electronic notebooks to seriously take notes. Meanwhile, Hua Xiaoxi played the role of a secretary. She brewed a cup of 3-leaf tea and placed it in front of Su Lu. We do have old grudges with Green Dragon Mountain, but don't forget that the school's philosophy class once said that everything has a primary conflict and secondary conflict. Who is our enemy now? The Empire's people. You are officers of the Federation, not gangsters. Do you think you are shooting a TV series by turning your grudges into a night market brawl? I'm not doing ideological work, and I don't know how to do it. I only know that what you're doing is very stupid and very wrong. The more Su Lu spoke, the more depressed and annoyed he felt. His face was getting worse and worse, his voice was getting colder and colder, and his attitude was getting worse and worse. The heads of his former students were getting lower and lower. He saw an opening and respectfully handed over a cigarette. He lit with both hands. Holding the cigarette between his index fingers, Su Lu continued to scold these guys in the smoke. If it were any other instructor, they would definitely not embarrass He and the others like this. They would always pay attention to a method. Occasionally, they would say a few words to reminisce about the past and their life in the base so that the relationship between teachers and students would be closer. This was not only using people, but also managing soldiers. The Department of Defense had let him enter the training base with the intention of letting these echelon officers, who the Federation focused on nurturing, become his reliable subordinates in the future. Naturally, they were willing to see such a scene. However, from the beginning, Su Lu had no intention of developing his own people in the army. Just as Secretary Bai was worried, this rock did not seem to have any interest in building his own team. Therefore, he was very simple and direct. He was not violent and was exceptionally cold. However, the strange thing was that the proud military officers and students liked this very much. The scolding in the meeting room continued. There were many more figures outside the door. All the officers in the Westwoods Military Police Headquarters heard about the scene in this room and came over excitedly to see what was happening. The Military Police Headquarters maintained the federal military discipline on the main planet of the Westwoods. They had dealt with countless cases of violation of rules and regulations. Every time, the Federation's various units would let these officers, who were focused on nurturing by the Department of Defense, come and get the people they wanted. These officers had a lot of face, many battle achievements, a strong background, and a bright future. They often slammed the table and cursed at the military police headquarters, causing the military police headquarters to be extremely embarrassed. However, who would have thought that one day these people would actually be scolded by someone like a grandson for half an hour? The long corridor outside the meeting room was filled with officers from the military police headquarters. These officers, who had the best discipline, finally couldn't help but whisper among themselves. Su Li's identity gradually spread. After the officers were shocked, they suddenly understood. They thought that only someone like this would be able to control the situation. However, in their opinion, Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu should be at least a regiment commander now. He might even be able to enter the headquarters of a large military region. He should at least be leading a special mecha team. Why was he still hanging around in the nutshell mercenaries? The reunion between the instructor and the students wasn't very happy. After a round of scolding, Hele and the other most arrogant fellows all gave up on the idea of getting people out of the military police headquarters. The other officers could only leave gloomily and report to their superiors. The gang fight at the Chrysanthemum Night Market still had to wait for the official investigation by the disciplinary department tomorrow. The military police headquarters finally regained its peace. However, since they were reunited, they couldn't just break up like this. When they went to the battlefield in the future, they didn't know if they would still be alive to see each other again. Sulu went to the resting room to pick up Miss Lulu. Then, he brought these officers and a portion of the members of Team 7 back to the majestic nightclub in a grandiose manner. The activities in the nightclub, naturally, turned into a drinking competition between men. The officers and students in the meeting room were like little chicks. They held 5 liters of beer bottles as if they were electromagnetic grenades and attacked instructor Sulu wave after wave. Seeing that Sulu was no match for them, Bayulon flipped the hair in front of her forehead and went up with the bottle. Dozens of members of Team 7 also launched a counterattack without holding back. Hele and the others were shocked by this formation and immediately called their former classmates. Now, the commanding officers of the various units came to help. The officers who had been trained at the base were now coincidentally summoned back to the main planet of the West Woods to attend the awards ceremony that would be held the day after tomorrow. The moment they heard Instructor Sue's summons, they roared into the phone and rushed over from their respective camps without hesitation. For a time, the screeching sound of brakes could be heard from the entrance of the majestic nightclub from time to time. 10 minutes later, all kinds of high-class military vehicles filled the entrance, especially those green military plates that represented their respective ranks. It made the pedestrians and soldiers on the street feel a lot of fear and confusion. No matter which military region they belonged to, which planet they were fighting on a few days ago, or perhaps they were cursing each other through the communication system, when they were cooperating, all the officers who could come had come, and some were even on their way. The training officers had lived together with the 18 men of Group 7 in the base and participated in the military drill on graduation day. Naturally, they were not unfamiliar with it. More than 100 people sat in the dark nightclub. Countless bottles of hard liquor were opened and poured into their steel-forged stomachs. They forcibly poured out the aura of the battlefield and the loud and clear military songs that were rough and hoarse but had a unique flavor. The pedestrians and soldiers on the street curiously looked at the high-class military vehicles that were strewn everywhere and whispered about the meaning of the military license plates. Suddenly, they heard a loud and ear-piercing song that pierced through the excellent soundproofing of the majestic nightclub. They couldn't help but wonder if the National Defense Award ceremony was held in the nightclub ahead of time. Chapter 483. They were all men who had come from the battlefield and had seen too many deaths, but none of them could really take life and death lightly. Instead, they valued rare encounters. After all, they did not know when they would meet again and how many people there would be left. Because of this mood, the soldiers in the nightclub drank, sang, and cursed without restraint. In the midst of this bustle, the last few officer cadets finally arrived at the gathering. The last to arrive was Zhou. All the officers sitting around stood up one after another and greeted the graduation day drill commander with a smile. Then, they noticed that there was a Scythian officer following behind him. The two of them looked somewhat similar. Sulu stood up and opened his arms to hug Zhou. Beside him, Bayulon also smiled. They had worked together for a long time in the engineering department of the port city and could be considered true old friends. Zhou Jin, my brother. He's now working at the West Woods Command Headquarters. Zhou's gentle and amiable face was still calm under the faint purple light. He introduced Zhou Jin loudly to the people around him and then brought Zhou Jin in front of Sulu. Sulu raised his eyebrows slightly. Looking at this officer, named Zhou Jin, he thought of the journey when he escaped from Eastwood many years ago. After a moment of silence, he extended his hand and said with a smile, "Hello, we meet again." Zhou Jin looked at this plain face and shook his head in surprise. "I've heard Zhou mention you a few times. In the past 6 months, I've often heard the name Su Lu on TV. I always thought it was a little strange, but I didn't expect it to really be you. The retired soldier on the ancient bell has now become a Federation hero. A few years ago, when Su Lu escaped from Eastwood, he had a conflict with the students of the Westwoods Military Academy because he took in Little Watermelon. After a few years, Zhou Jin was stunned to confirm that such a big change had happened to this person. The shock was very real. Zhou Yu and the officers around him were a little surprised. Could it be that these two people had met before? Zhou Jin gave a self-deprecating smile and briefly told the story of what happened on the ancient clock ship that year, which aroused a lot of emotions. The way they looked at Su Lu became even more strange. Instructor Su was just a soldier. Bai Yulan filled the glasses on the table to the brim with wine. Zhou Yu hurriedly thanked her. Sitting beside Su Lu, he whispered, "I might be transferred to the Iron 7th Division." Most of the cadets present probably did not have a good impression of Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7th Division, and this was even more so for the members of Team 7 from the 17th Division, which was why Zhou Yu kept his voice as low as possible. Su Lu was slightly taken aback. He frowned and asked, "Are you currently in the 1st Military Region?" "Yes," Zhou Yu replied, "but you're a student from the Westwoods Academy. How could Commander Zhong agree to let the Iron 7th Division poach you?" Su Lu rubbed his forehead. An outstanding talent like Zhou Yu was definitely a target that every division would want to win over. During the graduation drill last year, Du Shaoqing had personally tested Zhou Yu's tactical deduction ability. On the surface, it looked like he was suppressing the cadets' arrogance. But wasn't it also a form of appreciation for talent? It was understandable that the Iron 7th Division wanted to poach Zhou Yu, but he did not understand why the Westwoods Academy would agree. Zhou Yu raised his wine glass. There was a hint of heaviness in his calm expression. He said in a low voice, "The National Defense Department gave the order directly. The pressure is too great." Su Lu raised his wine glass and clinked it with Zhou Yu's. He downed the wine in one gulp and licked his tingling lips. He shook his head and smiled. "I think it's better not to worry about the back of the mountain. The Iron 7th Division does have a better future." Zhou Yu saw that his words had pointed out the crux of the matter. He could not help but lower his head and laugh self-deprecatingly. He tilted his neck back and emptied the wine in his glass. He exhaled and muttered, "I can't help it." Su Lu and Zhou Yu had been in contact by email, so they did not need to talk too much. Besides, the officers who came to drink with them from time to time did not give them much opportunity to talk. After countless rounds of drinking, the pretty girls in the nightclub had no chance to show their charm. The soldiers who came to gather drank and talked about their experiences on the front lines with red eyes. They talked about how red the blood of their comrades was at a certain cliff, how the Empire's bastards' fortifications were defeated in a certain mountain forest, and how cold their comrades' bodies were at a certain riverbank. The whole place was filled with a kind of atmosphere of heroism and sorrow, mixed with sadness and pride and solemnity. This place was only suitable for drinking, singing, and fighting. It was not suitable for women. The officers drank to their heart's content. They talked about their life after leaving the base, returning to their respective units, going to the front lines, and participating in fierce battles. Su Lu sat in the middle of the crowd and listened silently. He listened to the achievements of these former students and knew that most of them had been promoted. His heart, which was a little happy because of the influence of alcohol, naturally produced a lot of pride and satisfaction. The one who had been promoted the fastest was He. He was a 30-something-year-old lieutenant colonel who could only laugh foolishly because he drank too much. His unit had taken on an extremely heavy mission and had fought extremely hard and beautifully on 3320. The rest of the officers were already deputy regiment commanders, staff officers, and battalion commanders of reinforced battalions. After the award ceremony that was about to start, they would most likely be promoted again. He, you're only in your early 30s, but you're already a lieutenant colonel and regiment commander. How do you expect your brothers to survive? Lin Ai put her legs on the table and didn't let go of the bottle of red wine like she was holding child. She shouted loudly with the smell of alcohol all over her body. He forced himself to open his eyes that were almost unable to open. He chuckled and said, "The instructor is only in his 20s, but he's already a lieutenant colonel. Why don't you ask him?" "Fuck, who can compare to that monster?" Lan Xiaolong, who was stuffing fries into his mouth to suppress the smell of alcohol in his stomach, said disdainfully, "We don't have Mad Manly here." "That's true." Mizuru, who was known for his sarcasm in the training base, looked at He Lei mockingly and said, "And I reckon that you'll at most get 2 medals in this award ceremony. You won't have a chance to be promoted to colonel, right?" "Why?" A member of Group 7 expressed his confusion. He thought that with the achievements of He Lei's automatic regiment, it should be very common for them to be promoted in the front lines. "It's very simple," Zhou Yu interrupted with a smile. "Because our instructor is only a lieutenant colonel. Group 7 did a great job in laying the net for 163. Logically speaking, he should be promoted. The problem is that he's too young, and the Ministry of Defense has to be careful of the media, so it won't be his turn this time." "So I'm at a disadvantage now?" He Lei muttered. Suddenly, he stood up shakily and sat between Su Lu and Miss Lulu. He hugged Su Li's shoulder and asked loudly, "Instructor, I heard that you destroyed the Bureau of Proclamation. Is it true or not?" "Nonsense. How can a person destroy the Bureau of Proclamation?" "I just beat up an official of the Bureau of Proclamation," Xiong Linquan replied in a rough voice. "That's also very cool. Other than our instructor, who dares to beat up those bastard Bureau of Proclamation officials?" He Lei's eyes widened as he praised loudly. The officers around them were also very excited. They began to hit the table with all their might to express their excitement. Then, they began to howl wantonly like animals. Sulu shook his head. He was too lazy to pay attention to these crazy people. He narrowed his eyes and counted for a long time. He felt that other than the people who were killing the enemy at the front lines, there should be 2 or 3 people missing. However, after he asked the question, the scene suddenly fell into silence. 2 of them died at 3,320. The main force of the Imperial Expeditionary Force counterattacked for 14 consecutive days. The ground forces were under too much pressure. In the end, they personally controlled MX and rushed up. The position was saved, but they didn't come back. Hua Xiaoxi lowered his head and turned the wine glass. He explained to Su Lu, "Chong San is also dead. It's the Iron 7th Division officer who fought with you on the field last time." Zhou Yu said softly, "I heard that after he recovered from his injuries, he took a transport ship from S1 to the front lines. The moment he was assigned to the Iron 7th Division, the operation on 5460 began. I think it was during the first sniping battle at Yellow Mountain Ridge. He was hit by a boulder that collapsed from the Empire's Mecca and was buried directly in the mountain. His body wasn't even dug up." Sulu narrowed his eyes and was silent for a long time. He thought about how he controlled the black MX and flew like a bullet on the gentle slope. That proud and tenacious officer had already died silently. Perhaps the place where he died was not far from where he was at that time. He raised a full wine glass and slowly drank it all. Then, he rubbed his nose and said, "Bring another 100 bottles of good wine." All the officers were silent. They raised their glasses at the same time and drank the wine in their glasses in one gulp. The nightclub was a mess, but it was lively. The new members of Iron 7th Division sat in the outer circle and drank with the girls in their arms. They looked over at the other side from time to time with a hint of envy in their eyes. They envied the fact that the old members could get along so well with the officers in the army. They envied Supervisor Su Lu for being able to receive the heartfelt respect of so many fierce people. Although they came from extraordinary families and their fathers were rich and powerful, so they were not afraid when they saw people like the regiment commander. They had been in the army for a long time and had been influenced by the atmosphere of the camp. There was always a faint sense of envy and yearning. "I see you running behind the supervisor every day. I didn't expect you to still hold a grudge against him." Zhou Yu moved closer to Shi Peng, who had a complicated expression. He frowned and said, "Forget it. Although I hated him back then, we were still in the same army. If it weren't for these guys, I'm afraid we would have died many times over. I don't hold a grudge against him." Shi Peng rubbed her hair and looked at Su Lu, who was drunk and collapsed in the arms of a girl not far away. She said angrily. We have to help our friends. Besides, we just let him make a fool of himself and let us vent our anger. It's not like he will lose a piece of meat. Don't worry. He drank a mouthful of wine and said, I'm also a member of Iron's 7th Division. I won't betray my comrades. Zhou shrugged and didn't try to persuade him anymore. He thought that it was right. Anyway, there were already a lot of rumors about their supervisor. It wouldn't be a big deal if there were more. Chapter 484. The silver moonlight shone on the 4th-floor apartment in Hua, Cheng, Sunset Province. This was a small but exquisitely decorated suite. Su Lu lay on the soft bed, his mouth dry and his head dizzy. The smell of alcohol wafted out of every pore of his body. A faint ray of light shone into the room through the floor-to-ceiling glass, casting a charming shadow on the girl's bare collarbone. In the middle of the shadow was a thin band of cloth that seemed to be able to be broken with a finger. The last time he had experienced something between a man and a woman, it seemed to have been tens of thousands of years ago. That was a failure that dealt a serious blow to his self-confidence. Although it was beautiful, it was only related to the mind. In terms of the body, it was a complete mess. Stone had been roasted in the fire for so many days and had accumulated so much fire. Suddenly, he met a woman who was aroused by her profession and immediately began to burn fiercely. I want to vomit. Lulu froze for a moment, then covered her mouth and laughed. She got off the bed and placed a large basin beside the bed. She supported his body and gently patted his back, just like a gentle and affectionate older sister. He suddenly stopped moving and said vaguely, with a hint of regret and frustration in his voice, I still want to vomit. In the evening, Group 7 drank wine at the dinner, in the nightclub, in the night market, and at the big party, who knew how much they drank. The golden resplendence dimmed all the lights in the surrounding area to satisfy the officer's request of using alcohol to suppress or arouse certain emotions. Sulu alone drank at least 4 bottles. Even Li Pifu or Feng, you would probably die if they drank like this. Sulu is indeed not an ordinary person in many aspects. But in the face of the fair slaughter of alcohol, it would be abnormal if he didn't collapse. After washing away the eyeshadow and heavy makeup, Lulu was still beautiful. But her beauty was extremely clean. She raised the corners of her eyes and said, Will you pay me back in the future? In the early morning, Sulu woke up from his sleep. His body was extremely sore, and his throat was dry and painful. It was as if there were countless fish bones stuck in his throat. Su Li's body was very strong, and the mysterious burning power in his body was definitely not of any help to the matters between men and women, but it could help him recover his strength as quickly as possible. The hangover from last night left him with an occasional headache, but his mind was clear again. He quietly looked at Lulu in his arms, feeling the clear and alluring sensation. Hearing the light snoring from the girl's nose from time to time, he couldn't help but grin. Immediately, he swallowed a mouthful of saliva and lowered his head somewhat seriously and somewhat nervously, preparing to press his lips against hers. Right at this moment, a row of white, glowing symbols suddenly flashed in his left eye. These glowing symbols didn't move according to his will and stayed firmly in place. Although the person he was spying on was only his central computer, he always felt that the other party was an old and dirty hooligan. Thinking of this, he felt as if a bucket of ice water had been poured over his head. He reluctantly pulled his arm out from under Lulu's neck and sat on the bed with his head in his hands for a moment before he began to read the light talismans. The Federal Central Computer informed him that there was a target targeting him outside the apartment. The other party didn't have any weapons of mass destruction, so there was no danger. Su Lu silently sat on the edge of the bed. After thinking for a moment, he began to wash up and get dressed. On the way, he called by Yulan and asked her to come to the apartment to pick him up. Lulu didn't know whether it was the sound of water or the lack of temperature beside her that woke her up. She stared blankly at the young lieutenant colonel at the door. She held her chin and spoke with a slightly unnatural tone, just like the time when she teased him in the Stars Club lounge. She said frivolously with a smile, Come back at night? I'll give you a red envelope. Sulu walked down the stairs with his military cap. In the elevator, he kept his head down and muttered some indecent words. His heart was filled with some reluctance and unwillingness. It was not easy for him to make a decision under the dual encouragement of alcohol and desire. Unexpectedly, in the end, his body had an internal strife. Alcohol gave birth to desire, but it also destroyed some of the functions needed to fulfill that desire. Such an encounter was so depressing that he could not let it end. Standing at the side door of the apartment, he narrowed his eyes and looked at the quiet street in front of him and the towering trees across the street. He didn't find any danger, but he still carefully put on his sunglasses. He thought to himself that since the people following him were determined to be unarmed and not dangerous, why did the Federal Central Computer warn him in advance? In the distance, the black car was approaching. Sulu walked out of the apartment community and stood on the sidewalk to wait. Unexpectedly, his mind drifted to the room on the 4th floor again. It had nothing to do with emotions, but it was related to manhood. He raised his right arm with some doubts and made a forceful action. Looking at the bulging muscles under the military uniform, he thought that his ability in that area was indeed not proportional to his muscles. At this time, a flash suddenly lit up between the trees across the street. It was as if countless bolts of lightning cut through the quiet street and shone on his body, freezing his somewhat comical action forever. Since the National Girl scandal that shocked the entire Federation a few months ago, Sulu had long been accustomed to the fact that he was a celebrity. He also had a lot of experience dealing with reporters. However, at this time, he was still a little dazzled by the flash. He was a little flustered. The Federation's technology has advanced for countless years. The cameras are getting smaller and smaller, but why are the flashes still so big? At this time, he thought of something else very strangely. Then he looked at the dozen or so reporters rushing over from the opposite side of the street. His face became abnormally solemn. "Lieutenant Colonel Sulu, why are you here?" "Lieutenant Colonel Sulu, this apartment is the most famous apartment for single women in Sunset State. You should know what this means. Did you spend the night here last night?" "Lieutenant Colonel Sulu, please answer our questions." "Well, Lieutenant Colonel Sulu, I want to ask you, as an active military officer, is not returning to the barracks overnight a violation of military regulations?" Sulu stood silently on the side of the street, completely ignoring the questions of these reporters. When the black car arrived in front of him, he opened the door and got in. The reporters shook their heads and stood on the side of the street, quickly recording with the recording pens in their hands. Just as they thought the black car would leave in a cloud of dust, the car window rolled down. Sulu, wearing sunglasses, looked at the reporters and said, "Don't forget the confidentiality clause of the First Charter on citizen privacy. You can report on me, but if a single word involves other people, I will sue your newspaper until it closes down. As for you, I will send you to prison." After saying this, the black car silently drove away like a ghost. In the car, Sulu took off his sunglasses and was silent for a long time, secretly wondering who would use such a childish and boring method to trick him. What was their purpose? Thinking of something, he slightly frowned and said to Bai Yulan in the front seat, "Call Li Xiaotong." Chapter 485. The black car quietly slid into the barracks, and the heavy door was closed behind it. Lan Xiaolong and a few other officers, who heard the sound of the wind, came over and walked into the office. Because of the hangover, their faces were full of tiredness, and their eyes were bloodshot. After they understood what happened outside the woman's apartment, their faces became serious and ugly. Not long after, Su Li's military phone beeped, and Li Xiaotong sent an email. He read it carefully, and then leaned against the chair and closed his eyes to think seriously for a long time. However, he still couldn't understand this matter. The most promising young lieutenant colonel in the Federation was photographed by a news reporter violating military discipline by not returning home at night and visiting prostitutes at a time when the war was fierce. Such a scandal was published during a time when the war was fierce, and it was really shocking. And the person involved was Su Lu. This matter was not only shocking, but there was probably a deeper purpose. After Li Xiaodong received their call, he found some information in the shortest amount of time. The major media station in the West Woods could be so sensitive and had the guts to secretly follow Su Lu. It was indeed related to the giant Samlin United Bank. This seventh young master had always firmly and coldly placed trusted aides around his big brother, which was why he could find some information so quickly. However, he still couldn't find out where the media got the information from. Why did Li Xiaozhu do this? Su Lu opened his eyes and thought in confusion. Did he want to turn himself into a rotten egg because he still didn't give up on the marriage with the Lees of Philadelphia? Did Li Xiaozhu still put his heart on the nation's girls? However, because of Jianshi, Zhou Yu, and Zhang Xiaoming, in the eyes of many people in the upper and lower levels of the Federation, he had long been a silent flower stone. What good would it do him to ruin his reputation? More importantly, ever since the presidential election, Li Xiaozhu had been low-key and steady. With his temperament and ability, it was impossible for him to use such inferior and childish arrangements. His eyes narrowed as he thought of the two expert assassins who had been smuggled into the West Woods from Bermuda. Although the Federation Investigation Bureau had never been able to determine who the mastermind was, he could basically confirm that the person who wanted to kill him was definitely related to the young masters of the aristocratic families and the politicians of the capital ring. Li Xiaozhu's actions might be to cover up something, or to find a reason to stay out of it when the matter failed in the future. We've never been the kind of people who like to stir up trouble. The key is that there are always people who like to smear bullshit on our faces. Lan Xiaolong said in a deep voice. Outside the window, the members of Group 7 who had just woken up were sunbathing in groups of 2s and 3s. Under the big tree, Shi Peng kept smoking with her head lowered. Su Lu suddenly thought of the girl in the apartment building. He narrowed his eyes and said directly to Bai Yulan, "I'll call that girl later and see what she thinks. If she's willing, you can help me send her away. Also, you can call Li Xiaodong and ask him to help settle down in the capital ring." Bai Yulan nodded slightly. Group 7 had been doing private work in the dark all these years. It was not difficult to secretly send a person out of the West Woods. Other than the Bureau of Proclamation, no other department or organization would be able to find a trace. Next, Su Lu and the others discussed a lot of countermeasures to prepare for the upcoming news flood. They had just returned from the battlefield, and now they had to fight again. However, this time, the target of the battle had changed to the ubiquitous public opinion. Everyone felt very unhappy. The nightclub incident can be widely publicized. This can help to establish a positive image of you. Instructor Su's countless students are war heroes. This will make you feel very cool. Lan Xiaolong held the electronic pen in his mouth and said with a frown, "The key is last night. You have to give an answer. Do you admit it or not?" "Admit my ass. Nothing happened. Why should I admit it?" Su Li's expression was dark as he slammed the table and roared. The room was silent. Xiong Lin Quan and the others looked at each other, then lowered their heads and resisted the urge to laugh wildly. They thought that their boss was really shameless. He could even lie so confidently. Su Lu shook his head helplessly, picked up the phone, and walked out of the door. He began to ask for help from a certain lady in the capital ring. The next day, all the television media in the Federation remained silent, but all the print media and electronic media were in an uproar. Most of the pages of these media were still reporting the battle at the front line. On the 3 fallen planets, the Federation government army was marching toward victory step by step. 2 days after the general attack of the victorious military operation, they had entered the gentle slope period as planned. But on the 3rd page of their media, there was suddenly a scandal about a young lieutenant colonel. Because the first charter of the Federation strictly protected the privacy of citizens, there was not a single picture of the apartment in the media, and there was not a single sentence that involved the girl in the majestic nightclub. Although the title of the news was particularly sensational, the words strictly avoided the word prostitute and only described it with ambiguous words and vivid reasoning, hooking the reader's emotions step by step into some kind of trench. The sex industry in the Federation had never been officially legal, but there hadn't been a case that confirmed it was illegal for more than 300 years. The strict military discipline of the Federation naturally prohibited the purchase of sex, but what were the sanatoriums and high-end clubs all over the streets of the Sunset State for? Everyone, from President Pabre to the peddlers selling newspapers, knew very well. It just so happened that the young lieutenant colonel was called Su Lu. He was the object of the scandal of a national girl, Jian Shui'er. It was rumored that he had an affair with the daughter of the Minister of National Defense. It was also said that he admitted that he and Zhang Xiaoming of Green Dragon Mountain were old lovers. Therefore, this scandal or news had enough explosive power to make the people of the Federation relish, angry, and depressed. Almost everyone in the military camp of the Sunset State had a newspaper in their hands, including the members of Group 7. They wantonly laughed at Su Li's carelessness, but they didn't take the matter too seriously and didn't know the trouble it could bring. As soon as the news report came out, Su Lu received a top-secret email from the Ministry of National Defense. He opened the email and found that it was written by the bespectacled, scholarly minister himself. His heart thumped, and he insisted on reading the words that contained displeasure. He sighed silently in his heart and didn't reply immediately. A young man without a girlfriend now seemed to be responsible for the reputation of many girls. What was going on? Su Lu sat behind the table and thought for a long time in silence. He realized that he had brought all of this upon himself. Then, the officers of the Internal Affairs Department of the Ministry of National Defense entered the camp of Group 7. The news media had stirred up too much, and the people of the Federation were too concerned. The Internal Affairs Department was responsible for monitoring the behavior of high-ranking officers. In order to quell the controversy, they had to come and deal with this matter. Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu, we have been ordered to come and investigate. May I ask where you were the night before yesterday? Su Lu sat behind the table and glanced at them. He didn't say anything. This action caused the expressions of the officers of the Internal Affairs Department to change slightly. Just as the atmosphere in the room became a little strange, a middle-aged man in a black suit with a smile on his face walked in from outside the door. He walked directly to Su Li's table and looked back at the officers of the Internal Affairs Department. My client will not answer any of your questions. If you have anything to say, you can talk to me directly. Client. The officers of the Internal Affairs Department were stunned. They took the business card from the middle-aged man in black. After seeing the two words he on the Pure Plant long fiber business card, everyone's expression turned solemn at the same time. No matter how they thought about it, they could not understand why a routine investigation would actually attract the attention of Silin's most famous and most difficult lawyer to provoke. We just want Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu to cooperate with the Internal Affairs Department's investigation. We don't need a lawyer, right? The officer of the Internal Affairs Department said awkwardly. Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu will not accept any boring investigation. He said expressionlessly. Do you have an arrest warrant? No, but we have a notice of cooperation. That has no legal effect. He waved his hand and said in an unquestionable tone, my client will only go with you when you get the arrest warrant. Then he will speak with me. Other than that, don't disturb my client again. The officers of the Internal Affairs Department had very interesting expressions. It was clearly an internal investigation in the Army. How did it become the content of a legal drama? Lawyer I want to remind you that Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu is an active military officer. We have the right to ask him to cooperate with the investigation. And this is an internal military matter. He interrupted him expressionlessly. Are you trying to say that I'm a civil law lawyer and can't participate in military court matters? How did you learn this in school? That's not what I mean. The officer suppressed his anger and said, Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu is suspected of prostitution and has seriously violated the military discipline of the Federation. This is the truth, right? He suddenly said with a gloomy face, the first charter states that citizens of the Federation have 5 basic rights. Prostitution is the same as looking at pornographic pictures at home. It is a natural right. Who dares to say that this is a crime? Before the excited officers of the Internal Affairs Department could speak, the youngest son of the Supreme Court Justice of the Federation, the closest legal partner of the Zhong family in the West Woods, raised his eyebrows and said without holding back, Young people, you have to remember that no law can override the first charter. If the law passed by the Parliament and the military discipline regulations of the Department of Defense think that my client is suspected of a crime, then I think what you have to do is not to investigate my client, but to immediately change all these bullshit laws. Hearing these two sentences, the members of Team 7, who had been watching and cheering outside the room, all clapped their hands hard. Their palms were red from the clapping, and the sharp whistles pierced through the entire military camp. Looking at the officers of the Internal Affairs Department who left resentfully, Su Lu stood up, shook the lawyer's hand hard, and said seriously, "Thank you. You don't have to thank me. I'm just protecting the bottom line rights of the Federation citizens." He looked at Su Lu and suddenly said with a smile, "But I have to remind you, in the future, you have to be careful when you go out to play. My old father is a fanatic admirer of Miss Jianshi. If we really take the first charter case to the Supreme Court, we will definitely lose." Thinking that the Supreme Court Justice of the Federation might be reading the newspaper by the fireplace, while cursing a certain heartless man, Su Li's back suddenly broke out in cold sweat. Chapter 486. A ghost born from the Federation's upper-class society due to hatred, fear, and uneasiness, was hovering above Su Li's head, blowing a cold breath at the back of his neck from time to time. In the military camp at the Westwoods front line, Su Lu could clearly feel a certain cold wind from the Capitol Ring. It was inevitable that he would feel a little gloomy and angry. He had shed blood on the battlefield with his head held high, but his back was full of hostile gazes and thoughts. This kind of treatment could not be treated indifferently unless he had been fishing by the lake for more than 10 years. Insulting his spirit and destroying his body. The former was just a test, and even the handsome Li Xiuzhu had secretly expressed his attitude. He did not participate, but the latter was the key problem. After sending Lawyer He away, Su Lu sat behind the table and began to count with his fingers. Who exactly was involved in this matter? The elders at the top of the aristocratic families, the big shots in the political circle of the Capital Special District, they were extremely shrewd, cautious, and conservative all their lives. As long as they did not see the relationship between the Lees of Philadelphia and Su Lu, they would be silent for a day. On the other end of the cold wind, the end of the thread of the ghost was people like them. At this moment, Su Lu was probably already surrounded by a storm. So how could it be so sticky and annoying? From this perspective, the rest of the people who dared to ignore the attitude of the federal military and even the Lees of Philadelphia and secretly tried to destroy him physically must be very proud and very capable young people from the aristocratic families who were easily angered. They and Su Lu were in a completely different world. They were incompatible with each other, and once they collided, they would be annihilated or exploded. Lindo Hai, Nan Mingxiu, Zhong Erlang. These three names appeared in Su Li's mind. Because of Mrs. Zhong's phone call, Lawyer He appeared in the military camp. His appearance, to a certain extent, represented the attitude of the Zhong family in the Westwoods. Behind him was the reputation of the Chief Justice of the Federation. The Department of Defense was already under a lot of pressure to investigate this matter. Now, it naturally pushed the pressure away, and of course, it would not insist on the investigation. It was just that the officers of the Internal Affairs Department were a little annoyed. Immediately afterward, the giant Shell Motor Company, which spanned across the galaxy, sent a lawyer's letter signed by the president to all major media outlets, requesting that the media immediately stop the malicious reports that were full of slander and make a formal written apology. All parties exerted their strength, and the news media retracted after hearing the news. The storm caused by this incident gradually subsided. Su Lu, who was in the Westwoods Sunset State, did not let his guard down. He looked at the electronic map in his left eye and noticed that the two white dots that represented the target were getting closer and closer. He knew that a dangerous test was coming soon. However, the light was in his eyes, and no matter how professional an assassin was, to the current him, it was not a real test. The general offensive of the Victory military operation had entered its second week. The most powerful military force of the Imperial Expeditionary Force was gathered on planet 3320. However, under the watchful eyes of the glory of the Charter and the storm-like attacks of the Federation, the people of the Empire retreated step by step. After leaving behind countless soldiers' corpses, they miserably retreated into the rugged mountains to the west of the plateau. The offensive of the Federal forces suddenly slowed down. For some unknown reason, the frontline commander-in-chief, who was known as the Tiger of the West Woods, firmly ordered the various departments to slow down the speed of the offensive. The battle once again entered a stalemate. The stalemate today is different from the stalemate in the past. This is a fake stalemate. As long as the Federal forces are more ruthless, they can take down the last of the Imperial Expeditionary Force's territory at any time. It's just that the environment is limited, so presumably there will be more deaths. At the foot of the Green Peak, on the high ground beside the Flat River, there was a Federation military camp. From time to time, heavy black mechas would walk downstream along the river, their huge alloy mechanical feet leaving deep footprints on the sand and stones. The young master of the Tai family, whose pseudonym was Yuan Zitai, looked at the electronic map in front of him and said slowly to the person beside him, "Now, Du Shaoqing is in the limelight on planet 5460. Everyone thinks that he is the peerless general after the god of war, and subconsciously underestimated the Tiger, especially when they think of the Tiger suppressing the Iron 7th Division to not enter the West Woods. However, no one has ever carefully calculated the ratio of their losses. Du Shaoqing is as cold as snow, but his commanding style is as fierce as the wind, as tough as iron, and as sharp as the sharpness of his attacks. There is no other person in this world who can command a division, an army, or even a military region. But his problem is that this kind of commanding style will bring extremely heavy losses. Now, when he commands a division, the 3 military regions, or even the entire federal military, can continuously fill in people and supplies. But if he is like Commander Zhong, commanding hundreds of divisions, who will fill in? Tiger Zhong seems to be arrogant and aloof, but in reality, his commanding is neither rushed nor slow. Every step he takes is extremely precise, and he is good at using the least amount of energy to achieve the most results. In order to wait for the Bureau of Proclamation to finish setting up the net, he can withstand the pressure of the Parliament and the other big shots in the military and endure for so long on these 2 planets. Although he has the strong support of President Pabre, this cold and silent personality of his is still very scary. The most important thing is that the discussions of the ordinary people and the increasing number of conspiracy theories do not move his eyebrows at all. I don't know if it is a blessing or a misfortune for the Federation to have Tiger Zhong in the West Woods. Tai Ziyuan stayed on the front line for a long time. His body was still a little thin under the Major's military uniform, and his face was still unhealthily pale. It seemed that neither the lost radiation of the battleship nor the ultraviolet rays on the plateau could make him darker. But the Federation now needs continuous victories like the Iron 7th Division, not a tepid battle. Xuan Nain's rough fingers gently stroked the cold handle of the gun at his waist and said subconsciously, as the senior security director of the Blackhawk Security Company, he had always been by Tai Ziyuan's side and was always ready to exchange his life for Tai Ziyuan's safety when there was danger. There were many people like him in this military camp. The entire security force of the Blackhawk Security Company became the official federal forces through some means and surrounded Tai Ziyuan to protect him. This only showed that the influence of Macho Mountain in the Federation was really incredible. On planet 163, Su Lu had noticed that among the 3 security companies in charge of the Bureau of Proclamation's work, there were very few people from the Blackhawk Security Company. If he saw the figure of Director Xuan Nain at this moment, he could probably understand some of the real reasons. As the only heir of the Tai family for thousands of years, even if he wanted to fight for the Federation with blood like an ordinary citizen, it was impossible for him to have a completely ordinary life in a military camp. Whether it was the wife of Macho in the back of the mountain, the president in the official residence, or the big shots in the Parliament Mountain, none of them dared to put his safety at any risk. Tai Ziyuan didn't answer Shui Nain's words. He sneered slightly. In the Federation, probably only a young major like him could talk about the advantages and disadvantages of the two generals of the federal military in such a natural tone. This was the so-called family background. Going to the battlefield with hundreds of senior bodyguards, there's probably never been such a scene in history. Tai Ziyuan covered his mouth with his fist and coughed twice. His pale face flashed with 2 flashes of red. He said with self-mockery, "This is really too ridiculous." Shui Nain stood behind him with his head down, silent and not saying a word. No matter how angry the prince was, they couldn't leave his side. Thinking about his own abnormal military experience, Tai Ziyuan's mood became a little lonely. He raised his head and looked at the electronic newspaper on the screen. Looking at the picture of the guy wearing sunglasses standing in front of the apartment, acting cool, his mood finally improved. He smiled and said, "Sometimes I really envy this guy. I feel that his life is so much more exciting than mine." Outside the planet's atmosphere, a giant battleship reflected the cold and solemn color of the metal under the light of the stars. This was the flagship of the West Woods Federation's frontline headquarters. In the spacious warehouse on the penultimate level of the battleship, the sound of hydraulic pistons moving was soft and mesmerizing. The sound of spherical joints coming out was crisp and clear, accompanied by the sound of airflow compensation. The cockpit door of the giant black MX mecha opened. Li Feng walked out with a serious expression, carrying a pressure box. He jumped down from the tall mecha, his feet landing on the ground with a dull thud. His body, tightly wrapped in his military uniform, was filled with a powerful force, as if he would explode at any moment. Mechanical arms reached out from the wall and began to connect with the mecha systems. More than 10 mechanical engineers holding electronic notepads moved forward quickly and silently, beginning their daily maintenance. This MX mecha's 2 thick and cold mechanical legs were already painted full of gold stars. According to the usual practice in the Federation's military camp, the gold star that represented the number of kills would only be painted on the left mechanical leg, but Li Feng's mecha was an exception. This was because he had defeated too many Empire mecha on the battlefield. There were so many that one mechanical leg could not contain all the gold stars. Looking at the eye-catching countless gold stars, the mechanical engineers and the surrounding Federation soldiers subconsciously turned their heads to look at Li Feng, who was walking into the tunnel. They looked at the young lieutenant colonel's valiant back, and their eyes naturally showed respect and passion. On the highest level of the battleship, I forced the various troops to slow down their attack speed. This matter has already caused a lot of discussion, especially in S1. Beside the floor-to-ceiling porthole, there was an extremely luxurious leather chair behind a long table. If this chair fell into the eyes of the HTD Bureau employees, they would probably go crazy. However, the middle-aged man wearing the lieutenant general's gold star epaulette on the chair didn't seem to feel anything. His palm casually slapped the armrest as he silently looked out the window. Only his somewhat lonely back was left to Li Feng as he walked into the room. "What discussion?" Li Feng stood behind the general and asked in a low voice. This young lieutenant colonel's temperament was violent and warlike, but as a descendant of a military family, he did not only know how to charge and fight blindly on the battlefield. Being at the front lines, he could very well understand the true intentions of the commander's orders. Moreover, as a soldier, he had to obey orders. Many people in the Senate say that I purposely left the Imperial Expeditionary Force to increase my own importance, the middle-aged general in the chair said with a smile. There was no trace of anger in his tone. It was extremely calm. "Let them eat shit," Li Feng replied very directly. "Sometimes I also think about it. Perhaps my subconscious mind already has this kind of thought." The man in the leather chair slowly turned around. This commander of the Federation's 4th military region, the head of the West Woods Zhong family, a legendary figure who had crossed a corner of the galaxy and fought against the Empire alone for more than a decade. At this moment, actually appeared somewhat tired and old. "Uncle Zhong, this joke is not funny." The tiger of the West Woods had the surname Zhong, and his name was Shouhu. His slightly thin body was tall and straight, as if every bone contained a sense of pride and unruliness. When he suddenly heard the words of the younger generation, his silver eyebrows raised. The tiredness and self-mockery instantly disappeared, only leaving behind a strong spiciness. It was so spicy that it made people's heart palpitate. It was like a cup of tiger bone wine, extremely frightening. Chapter 487. Li Feng put his hands behind his back. His military posture was perfect. His thick eyebrows were straight on his young face. He looked at the general in the leather chair and thought of the recent events and the rumors from the capital ring. His expression naturally became a little gloomy. Whether it was the people of the Federation or the Empire, every time they thought of the Westwood's skinny tiger, they would always think of arrogant, cold-blooded, and terrifying. But very few people would think that behind the glory represented by the dark-colored military uniform, the number one military and political figure in the West Woods bore an unbearable pressure that ordinary people could not bear. Even the bones of the tiger seemed to creak under the pressure. Li Feng could feel it. He grew up in the front line of the West Woods. The courtyard and wire road was like his second home. He knew very well how the politicians and civilians of the capital ring felt about the Westwoods region. Historically speaking, the three prosperous planets in the Upper Woods region had never really treated the Westwoods region as an equal partner. The Federation government had always been secretly vigilant against the existence of the Zhong family. This time, the Federation launched a cleanup operation against the Imperial Expeditionary Force. The current master of the Zhong family, who had been fighting the Empire alone for more than 10 years, naturally became the commander-in-chief of the front line. However, the pressure from the parliament and the military had always been with him. The upper echelons of the Federation knew about the problem between Commander Zhong and Du Xiaoqing, but they forcibly resisted the cold suppression of the tiger and sent Du Xiaoqing's Iron 7th Division to the front line. When Commander Du Xiaoqing, wearing sunglasses, stood on the Yellow Mountain, the pressure became more and more real, urgent, and heavy. Many people in the army still remembered that in the military operation on Base 5460, 2 senior officers of the Westwoods military region were directly arrested and brought back to the capital ring for trial because they failed to rescue the Iron 7th Division. What did this mean? During this period of time, after the military operation began, the Iron 7th Division, led by Du Xiaoqing, fought like a whirlwind on Base 5460. Their morale soared to the sky, and they won a series of invigorating victories. Although he was only a major general on the battlefield, and the Iron 7th Division was only a part of the enormous war machine, he had already become a hero and idol in the hearts of the Federation citizens under the full power of the Federation propaganda machine. In stark contrast, Commander Zhong, who was in charge of this military plan with more than 100 majestic soldiers in his hands, seemed to be a little silent. Although he was the commander-in-chief, there were always some problems when one side was losing and the other side was gaining. In many people's eyes, every time Du Xiaoqing and his Iron 7th Division won a beautiful victory on Planet 5460, the Westwoods Tigers would feel a little more pressure and look a little more embarrassed. Li Feng was an excellent professional officer. He had no objections to Du Xiaoqing, but he had a natural resistance to this kind of shadow behind the spicy battlefield. What made him feel a little surprised was that the powerful and high-ranking man in the chair seemed to be calm, so calm that it was somewhat unfathomable. "Commander," Li Feng lowered his head and thought for a moment, then suddenly spoke. Zhong Shouhu lowered his gaze slightly, and a trace of gratification flashed across his face that was as calm as the eternally unchanging galaxy. He said, "This is my private study." "Yes." Li Feng raised his head and said solemnly, "Uncle Zhong, I want to talk to my family." His family was the Lees of Philadelphia. The old man, who had been watching the snowy mountains by the lake for more than 10 years, had not spoken about specific matters of the federal military for a long time, except when he entered Allure prison to meet a certain young man. If Li Feng wanted to talk to his family, it would naturally be to talk to this old man. No matter how much the politicians of the capital ring or the military feared the Zhong family of the West Woods, as long as the old man stood out and expressed his attitude, all the pressure would most likely disappear for a while. After the Federation wiped out the Imperial Expeditionary Force, it was inevitable that they would counterattack the Empire through the two warp tunnels. During such a tense war, Li Feng believed that his grandfather would not want to see problems within the Federation and would be willing to stand out and make the Federation more united. Hearing this, Zhong Xiaohu narrowed his eyes slightly, and two complicated and inexplicable cold lights shone out. No one knew what he thought, but in the end, this emotion turned into a smile. He looked at the young lieutenant colonel in front of him and smiled slightly. He thought of the scene many years ago when this child, who had just turned 12 years old, came to the West Woods with a face full of tears. He knew that the young man had good intentions, but don't forget your own identity. Zhong Xiaohu's expression turned serious, and he said sternly, "You're an officer of a military region. These things are not up to you to speak." Li Feng stubbornly held his head high. Although he did not know why this uncle, whom he respected greatly, would not accept his good intentions, he was not willing to back down. "Keep some distance from me, little guy," Zhong Xiaohu said coldly. Zhong Xiaohu replied with a cold expression, "I don't want Li Zidao calling me every day to bother me. You're his son, not mine." Li Feng pursed his lips and held his head high. The veins on his neck, which was as tense as a mountain rock, occasionally popped out. He seemed to be angry at these words. Zhong Xiaohu did not care about the young man's beautiful sadness and worry. He closed his eyes slightly and naturally changed the topic to another very interesting topic. In the past, the Federation did not have the habit of grading machine control standards. Only the Empire has. The army started to learn from them and started grading. That was a strange habit that started from the Second Military Academy about 20 years ago. I don't know if it has anything to do with that traitorous mechanic. However, I have to admit that this entire grading system is indeed somewhat useful for evaluating the strength of mecha warriors like you. You passed level 6 a few years ago. It is said that the Empire's princess was even younger than you when she passed level 6. Zhong Xiaohu looked at him with a strange smile and said, "At the latest next year, the Federation forces will appear at the Khaki Corridor. The war will start in the Empire's homeland. You will definitely have the chance to meet this princess. Do you have any expectations?" For the Imperial Expeditionary Force and the special pilots who had infiltrated the Bermuda Mineral Star, the powerful and violent young Lieutenant Colonel Madman, Li was their eternal shadow. Fortunately, the Empire also had a talented young person, and that was their powerful princess. The Empire's royal family naturally would not let the young girl go into battle to kill the enemy, but their propaganda machine kept promoting the strength of this princess. Many soldiers and civilians of the Federation still remembered that when the Empire's negotiation team came a few years ago, the Empire's officials would tremble with excitement every time the princess was mentioned. It was as if they had been injected with stimulants, and they clamored for a war with the Federation. The Federation had Li Feng, and the Empire had the princess. Once these two talented young people met on the battlefield, no one knew what kind of dazzling brilliance would erupt. Even with Zhong Xiaohu's status and shrewdness, he could not help but be curious. However, after thinking about it seriously for a long time, Li Feng shook his head. The genius princess's royal title is Su Ming. No one knows what her alias is in the Empire's military department, which unit she is in, what position she holds, but I think her surname should be Huai, Zhong Xiaohu said indifferently. According to the news from Bermuda, this princess is not the product of another Empire's god-making campaign. She is like you, young, but very strong. She is even stronger than we thought. The entire universe sees her as your lifelong enemy. It is not an insult to you, but she is still a woman. Li Feng replied firmly, "Women will be women. Their name is the weak." Zhong Xiaohu was slightly taken aback. He picked up a cup of coffee and took a sip. He sighed and said self-deprecatingly, "When you get married, you will know how terrifying women are." Li Feng could not understand the middle-aged man's meaning behind these words. After a pause, he said seriously, "Perhaps this Princess Su Meng is very strong, even stronger than me. But a battlefield is a battlefield. I do not expect to have a fair fight with her. If it really becomes a mecha battle, the Empire only has her. The Federation has me, and Su Lu. She will lose. I didn't expect you to have such a high opinion of Su Lu. Although I hate this guy, I have to admit that he is very talented in mecha. I am very curious about his relationship with your family." "Sorry, Uncle Zhong." Zhong Shouhu smiled and did not ask any more questions. Li Feng frowned and asked curiously, "Uncle Zhong, I want to know what level you are. What is the level of Colonel Tian that I have never seen before? Grandfather and father mentioned you too in the Feiqing family. They said that you two are stronger than me, but I did not believe it. In the end, Mad Manly was still Mad Manly. Even in the face of the celestial forest tiger, who was close and powerful to him, he did not hesitate to declare his undisguised ambition for certain territories. I don't need to mention it. As for Mr. Tian, his level is definitely not as high as yours. But if you were really thrown on a planet for more than 100 days, I think the one who will survive in the end will be him and not you." "Why?" Li Feng asked, puzzled. "Because he is much more shameless than you. And in order to survive, this kind of shamelessness is often required." Zhong Shouhu said emotionally, "That fatty you are curious about is the most shameless and lowly person I have ever seen in my life. He is full of petty tricks, but he is definitely not a genius with great wisdom." Li Feng was silent. He thought to himself, for Zhong Shouhu of the West Woods to have such an evaluation, what kind of existence must that Colonel Tian be? "This time, I transferred you back from the surface to let you return to the main planet to rest for a while." Zhong Shouhu looked at the young lieutenant colonel in front of him with a gentle gaze. "The Federation can't endlessly exploit a kid like you. Minors need to be protected. It's just that other than Chief Judge Ying, no one dares to question your grandfather's decision. I can hold on. I don't need to rest. I am going back to Sun Province soon. What are you still doing on this stupid planet?" Chapter 488. 97% of the net has been set up on the 3 fallen stars. 1/3 of the Federation's forces have been thrown in. What else can the Empire soldiers hiding in the mountains eat other than synthetic meat? Even if an idiot is the commander-in-chief, it is impossible for us to lose again. Why should I stay here? Zhong Shouhu turned his body slightly and looked at the beautiful planet below the warship. The dividing line between darkness and light was so obvious on the pale yellow planet. Every small spark that occasionally flashed between the hemispheres of the night actually meant a powerful explosion. Who knew how many of his men and enemies of the Empire had died in the explosion? It was a very simple statement, but it was a matter of course and even revealed a sense of arrogance and confidence. This confidence came from his experience of resisting the Empire alone at the border of the West Woods for more than 10 years. It came from the meticulous preparations he and the federal military had made in the past year. It came from the deep traces of his command arrangements in the past 100 days. However, immediately after, he let out a sigh from behind the leather seat that was the complete opposite of his previous arrogance. I kind of miss the red oil rat meat at the intersection. The Federation's victory in the military operation was already inevitable. A faint sense of boredom grew in the heart of the supreme commander of the military. He said, "The Empire's princess is waiting for us on the other side of the nebula, but the Federation's crown prince has already begun to take off his clothes and go into battle bare-chested. And you, Sulu, this guy that even I often find baffling. I kind of look forward to what will happen in the future." Hearing the 3 words crown prince, Li Feng's eyes drooped slightly. He remembered that Tai Ziyuan was currently hiding his identity and risking his life to fight on the planet below. Macho had always been on good terms with the Lees of Philadelphia. He had also met Tai Ziyuan a few times and somewhat admired this person who had a different temperament from the average noble family. According to the rumors circulating in the ground base, Major Yuan Zitai was currently commanding 2 combined battalions and was doing an excellent job, but that guy's health seemed to have always been a little weak. Whether or not you can survive the battlefield is mainly related to good luck. Li Feng suddenly thought of the words his grandfather had said to him when he was very young. Thinking back to the deformed and iron-blooded life he had started at the age of 12, the thrilling scenes he had experienced on the battlefield, and even the cold glance of the god of death in the smoke, the young lieutenant colonel's heart that had always been fearless and incomparably ruthless suddenly constricted. Glacial mines, dense forests in the wilderness, so many stray bullets, so dense gravel, and endless wildfires. That they didn't know and didn't care whether you were a princess or a crown prince, whether you were a simple and honest recruit like a farmer or a veteran ruffian like a viper. No matter how talented a person was or how promising his future was, he could still die a horrible death on the battlefield. No gold can be found in the waves. Only the natural elimination of life and death on the battlefield can truly welcome the final victor. Following the rotation of Planet 163, the Federation's battleships slowly entered the dark sky. Most of the light from the star was blocked by the planet. The surrounding space transitioned from dark blue to heavy black. Shadows seeped in from outside, the floor-to-ceiling porthole, and completely covered Zhong Shouhu's body on the chair. It also covered his words with a layer of cold and strange flavor. The upper echelons of the Federation have always been paying attention to Big Secretary Shun Macho in the back of the mountain. There are several outstanding successors of the 7 great families, but they don't understand that without experiencing a real battlefield, these young people will always have fatal flaws. I admire Lin Banshan, but this broken family's nature is too free. He only likes to live his unrestrained life in Bermuda. Fortunately, there are other young people. In the rotten soil of the Federation, which is full of darkness and blood, it can actually grow clean fruits like Sulu, Yu, and Tai Ziyuan. This is truly a miraculous thing. Perhaps the history of mankind and the development of the Federation will ultimately be as boring and dark as the past tens of thousands of years. But we always have to believe that the future may be clean. This way, the citizens who don't know the truth can walk more firmly. This sentence was said by George Carlin. I quite agree. I hope that the future of the universe is a group of clean young people like you. But sadly, I can always see that in the future, you will be infected with that disgusting old aura like me. This kind of aura is often associated with some very pleasant words, such as responsibility. Then you have to consider the overall situation. To consider the overall situation, you have to sacrifice the interests of a few people. Once this kind of active choice of sacrifice begins, you are no longer clean. The automatic lights in the room of the warship slowly lit up. Zhong Shouhu's white eyebrows, which were as if he was lying still, showed a hint of self-mockery as he said, "Little guy, I only want to remind you of one last thing. A future that is obtained by sacrificing others can only be a boring repetition with no future." Li Feng was silent for a moment. He gave a serious military salute and replied seriously, "Commander, although I can't completely understand, I know what I should do if I encounter such a situation in the future. This world is yours, and it is also ours. But in the end, it belongs to those bastards." In the military camp of the Sunset Province, Lan Xiaolong held a tree with one hand and hooked the military belt at his waist with the other. He sneered at the apology notice on the front page of the electronic newspaper about a false news report. He recited this sentence aloud in a recitative tone to express his deepest disdain for the boring politicians and meddlesome reporters of the capital ring. The members of Group 7 were training under the leadership of Xiong Lingquan. The Bureau of Proclamation's net-laying mission had basically been completed. The Department of Defense had not issued any new instructions to this small unit that was resting, so they could not carry out targeted training. They could only diligently carry out the arduous battlefield simulation exercise to ensure that a few more of them could survive on the battlefield in the future. In the shadows next to the training ground, the Venus Documentary Film Studio's camera crew was still faithfully carrying out their work. They shot a huge amount of material, then edited and condensed it into a short 10 minutes and sent it to thousands of households' TV screens. Lu Jiao, who had forcefully left the hospital and returned to the team, was currently resting on a hammock beside a tree with his eyes closed. He had been shot in the abdomen, so he was the key target of Group 7. Ho Xiandong sat on the medical box and followed closely behind. After hearing Lan Xiaolong's recitation, Lu Jiao opened his eyes and laughed out loud in pain. The bowl-like treatment device on his abdomen bobbed up and down, as if it could shoot out at any time. Bai Yulan looked at him worriedly, worried that he would laugh until his intestines fell out or break. Su Lu sat on a military bench. He seemed to be carefully reading an internal document from Nutshell Company, but in reality, he was using the central computer to sort out the movements of the two white dots in his mind. At the same time, he was paying attention to the movements of the Federation's military operations. Stop reciting Schiller's lines. We can take it, but Lu Jiao can't. He raised his head and waved his hand at Lan Xiaolong, who looked like a stage actor. Yo, I only know that our commanding officer Su Lu can smell the difference between the 37 types of engine oil used in the M-Series mecha and can feel the breast size of all the girls in the golden splendor with one hand. Lan Xiaolong was full of complaints. He said sarcastically, I didn't expect you to be such a literary youth. You actually know these are Master Schiller's lines. What's the matter? Are you trying to show off in front of a master's student like me? The gang fight in the Chrysanthemum Night Market, followed by the news of Su Li's incident, made it inconvenient for Group 7 to go out on the streets. The soldiers had locked themselves in their barracks, and they had already vented some of their anger. Hearing Lan Xiaolong's mocking words, Su Li didn't get angry. He shrugged his shoulders and said, I've told you many times. I've read a lot of literature books. I'm full of cultural knowledge, but you just don't believe me. After saying this, he stood up, patted his butt, and walked into his office. He opened his workbench and began his daily routine of receiving emails from the capital ring. The first email was from Shang Xiao. She introduced the progress of the Nutshell Engineering Department's research on adding a pressurizing system to the MX mecha. At the same time, she asked how it felt to use the MX mecha that had been specially modified for Su Lu by all her colleagues in the engineering department. Su Lu only wrote, "Thank you," in his reply before stopping. A bitter smile flashed across his face. In the past few months of battle, he had never had the chance to use a mecha. How could he talk about how it felt? At the end of the email, Shang Xiao mentioned very seriously that she might bring a testing team to the Westwood's front lines in the near future. Thinking of the death that was everywhere on the front lines, Su Li's brows furrowed. He was a little worried. Suddenly, he remembered that Shang Xiao's name was not in his long-winded last words before the last mission on Starship 3320. How shameful. The second email was from Jian Shuier. In the email, she said that she had sent him a gift. She asked him to remember to sign for it and keep it a secret. As for the mailing process, he didn't need to worry about it. It was sent under the name of the Philadelphia family, so the military would probably treat it seriously. Su Lu was startled. He didn't understand what kind of gift it was that it needed to occupy the tight military supply channel and make Jian Shuier willing to use the authority of the Lees of Philadelphia. He couldn't figure it out no matter how hard he thought about it. He sent an email to ask about it seriously. After dealing with the matters at hand, he walked out of the barracks and whispered a few words to Bai Yulan. Then, he drove the black car out of the barracks. At the entrance of the barracks, the black car was stopped by the team members who had just finished a round of brutal training. A few of the team members said excitedly, "Boss, the video crew just said that the third episode will be aired next week. Don't forget to watch it then." Currently, the most important event in the Federation was, of course, the war at the Westwood's front lines. And for the millions of citizens, this important historical event was the truest manifestation of it. What they cared about the most was the documentary called Team of Seven. This documentary had only aired 2 episodes, but it had already caused a frenzy of viewership in the Federation. Presumably, when the 3rd episode was aired, there would be countless television screens showing the same spectacular scene. Su Lu was slightly startled. He thought that it seemed to be released earlier than the news channel's announcement. Could it be related to the news incident from a few days ago? Lan Xiaolong squeezed into the crowd and asked loudly, "Where do you want to go by yourself again? Take me with you." Sula looked at him and answered honestly, "I want to go to Wire Road to see rabbits." Lan Xiaolong's face darkened. He took a deep breath and said, "I don't discriminate against homosexuals, but don't you think it's a bit too arrogant and shameless to shout it out so openly?" He immediately turned around and left the black car. He complained, "Is this the future that the Federation is focusing on cultivating? Yesterday, I wrote a few hundred words in the morning, boarded the bus at noon, arrived at Wuhan in the evening, and wrote a few hundred words at the airport. It was very tough. On the plane, I wrote more than 1,000 words. After finishing yesterday's chapter, my mood was stable. Then, I arrived at the hotel in Harbin at 11:40. I stayed at many places, but last night I couldn't go online. I couldn't make a phone call either. I was very annoyed at that time, so I tried to use my phone to update. I confirmed a second time, but it was absolutely impossible. At least I couldn't do it. I didn't care about the traffic, but I couldn't get into the authors section. Then I called my leader and sent her an MMS, asking her to help me update. In the end, my leader was much more talkative than I was, and she admitted it. Both sides were angry. She said that I should take a leave of absence, but I couldn't accept it because I said I wouldn't update. Most importantly, I had written it. If I stopped, it would be a loss. That was Do E's feeling. You can understand, so I insisted. Phone QQ? I couldn't send a document. Same here. I was also a talkative. In the end, I sent an email, but the format was completely destroyed. My leader had to rearrange it. It was already very late. My leader asked me if I could say anything. I said you can say it. She said she was too tired to say anything, so she didn't say anything. That was why he had said so much nonsense today, just to vent his emotions from last night. Damn it. I arrived in Daqing this afternoon. I pressed my palms together. There are also a few sentences. I wore a short-sleeved shirt when I boarded the plane. Before I alighted, the stewardess sweetly said it was minus 13 degrees Celsius. Uncle Harbin, who had stayed in Sanya for 4 months, was so angry that he was about to explode. I didn't explode. I brought enough warm clothes, but I still caught a cold. He sighed with emotion for the nth time. Our great motherland is so fucking big. He sighed with emotion for the nth time. I am a useless pig who is not sentimental, but is extremely sensitive. I'm a clumsy and ugly-looking, but is extremely delicate. I wish everyone a happy life, as long as you have a better life than me. In the end, I finally smiled. Chapter 489. The first glass of wine. The sun shines brightly. The ivy outside the window crawls into my eyes. The second glass of wine. The spring breeze gently ripples. The leaves gently caresses me. The third glass of wine. The birds lightly pecks at my heart. The fourth glass of wine. The shadow on the windowsill makes me forget who I am. The fifth glass of wine. The youth is about to fly through the layers of green forest. The sixth glass of wine. The stone path bends, a girl at the end. A girl at the end of the stone path. Girl. That's my little girl. These are all my girls. The black car was driving on the sunny Sunset Highway. The car with the sunroof was finally not as old as before, but more of the emotions that a young man should have. Sitting alone in the car, chewing the spring breeze that blew in his face. Su Lu was once intoxicated, but it was rare for him to release the deepest part of his emotions. He loudly sang the old song. His slightly hoarse voice was not very pleasant to listen to, but it was particularly enjoyable. The song was the 27 glasses of wine. After the sixth glass, the rough and direct, the lively lyrics were not the original lyrics. In the past, Shi Qinghai and Su Lu would drink every time. Every time they drank, they would get drunk. Every time they were drunk, they would sing this song loudly. When they were sad, Mr. Shi would silently and softly repeat the last few lyrics about his father. When they were happy and excited, he would only sing the first 1/5 of the song. When they sang the sixth glass of wine, the man's voice would stop here. Like a retro black record needle, he would tirelessly hum the girl at the end of the stone path. He would frown, wink, and look at the beautiful girls around him until his voice became hoarse. He would shout the lyrics directly from the bottom of his heart to his own girls. In the past, Sulu always felt that Qinghai's declaration of wanting to subdue all the young women in the world was too direct and abrupt, and it was even more embarrassing when he blushed. But at this time, the road was accompanied by the bright sunshine and the wind of youth. He was not in a dark room, and there was no taboo of mold, but he could freely breed frivolous thoughts that were most in line with the way of nature. No matter how brave or even presumptuous he was to sing out these frivolous thoughts, it was actually so happy. He was in his 20s and was born in a lowly place. Now, he was already a hero of the Federation and a high-ranking military officer. He was in charge of a group of fierce people and rich kids from aristocratic families. He had many extraordinary friends and enemies. Cunning and ruthless politicians had suffered losses in front of him. Even powerful people would have a headache when they heard his name. He had scandals with the nation's young girls and was secretly admired by the daughters of aristocratic families. He had enough qualifications to be proud of himself in the spring breeze and enjoy the speed of the black car. The award ceremony held by the Federation on the front line had ended. The military officers and students from various troops had specially made a trip to the barracks to say goodbye to him, and then embarked on the journey again. Sulu was very clear about what he and these military officers and students would encounter on the battlefield. But perhaps it was because he had seen so many life and death situations on the front line. This time it was very difficult for him to have the same feeling as the last time in the base cafeteria. Instead, he had a bit of a fierce and straightforward feeling. Farewell today. See you on the battlefield in the future. At this time, the song penetrating the blue sky and white clouds from the skylight, and the repetitive and boring words of girl abruptly stopped. Sulu knitted his thick, ink-like eyebrows and slowly drove the black car to the side of the road and stopped. He silently looked at the three-dimensional map made by the white lines in his left eye. Looking at the two white dots that had already entered the edge of the city, he couldn't help but feel a bit annoyed. It was not a good thing to be disturbed at such a happy moment. He turned on the car computer and brought up the map on the light screen. He squinted his eyes and carefully looked at it for a long time. Although the old man could now directly simulate the map in his mind, he didn't know if it was because of his biological instincts, but he was more used to looking at the map on an object outside his body. Taking out the electronic notebook of the past few days and carefully combing through the records one by one, Sulu finally confirmed that the two experts from Bermuda finally couldn't hold it in anymore and were ready to make a move. Lao Bai, they're here. You guys pick me up at Wayer Road in an hour. The car phone was directly connected to the communication system set up by Group 7 in the barracks. After a pause, he said softly, "Get ready to work." After saying this, he hung up the phone and didn't say anything more, because he believed that with the expertise of Group 7, they would definitely know better than him what needed to be prepared. Wayer Road was not a road, nor was it a street. It referred to an independent street in Sunset State, the main star of the Westwoods, so when people talked about it, they were used to calling it Wayer District. This street covered a large area, but it looked extremely quiet and ordinary. Other than the endless green forests and hills full of rustic charm, the scattered buildings were not tall and even looked a little old. Wayer District was a straight road, and there were many unknown restaurants at the intersection. Although the decorations were not luxurious, they looked quiet and noble. It was not mealtime, but there were still many tourists and military officers eating happily. Going up the straight road and into the street, the atmosphere suddenly changed. Under the shadow of the century-old giant trees on both sides of the street, there were armed sentries standing every 10 meters. These sentries had firm and silent expressions, and the military uniform of the West Forest Military Region looked especially straight, portraying the word solemn to the extreme. Su Li's gaze looked through the car window, and he could even faintly see the silhouettes of some heavy firepower equipment. On the lower edge of the floor of an old building, there was a pipe labeled PLC, which made him keenly feel that there might be equipment installed in that building specifically used to monitor the thermal fluctuations of Mecca. Wayer District was not a place that just anyone could enter. Even though Su Lu was a lieutenant colonel of the Federation, had a special pass issued by the Department of National Defense, and also secretly had first-class authority in the Bureau of Proclamation, if not for the Lady Sister's call, the black car still would not have been able to enter. This was because this was the old house of the Zhong family in the Westwoods. The black car stopped in front of the old house with the number 36. Su Lu walked down and smiled at the Zhong family service staff who greeted him. He took off his sunglasses and looked at the statue in the small square in front of the old house. His mood became strange. Why was the old house of the Zhong family not number 1, but number 36? There might be a very old story behind this, but Su Lu did not want to waste his brain power to think about it. He just stared at the statue in a daze. Under the blazing sun, the retro bell in the middle of the small square shone with a golden luster. It was so familiar. Su Lu raised his eyebrows. There was an almost identical statue on the bell tower street where he grew up. Why was there another one in front of the old house of the Zhong family in the Westwoods? He thought about the giant company owned by the Zhong family in the West Woods called the Ancient Clock Company. He thought about the battleship called the Ancient Clock. Could it be that the most powerful of the 7 great families, the Zhong family, had something to do with the deserted Eastwoods planet where he grew up? In the corner of the old house's backyard, there was an exceptionally clean greenhouse. There were countless beautiful plants growing in it. There was a space on the right side of the greenhouse where there was a huge cage. The floor of the cage was covered with green grass. What was hard to imagine was that there were even wild vegetables and radishes that rabbits liked to eat. A fat white rabbit was lying in the middle of the empty cage. It was bored to death. The blood vessels in its slightly drooping long ears could be seen. It was not interested in the delicious food in front of it. It squinted its myopic eyes and stared at the butterflies flying among the plants outside the cage. It seemed to be a little depressed because it could not find the meaning of its life. Su Lu looked at all of this in silence. There was a strange feeling in his heart. The little master of this place had not come back for many years. He did not even know if he would have a chance to come back in the future. However, the old people in the old house of the Zhong family were still meticulously taking care of everything here. He did not want to be disturbed by this feeling. He pointed at the grass in the cage and asked curiously, "Aren't you worried that the rabbit will dig a hole and leave? 3 meters of soil. Below that is the metal floor. The rabbit can't dig." The white-haired old house staff smiled and replied, "This guy dug who knows how many times 2 years ago. I'm afraid it has already accepted its fate." Hearing the words 2 years ago, Su Li's heart moved slightly. He roughly understood something. After a moment of silence, he politely asked, "Can I take some pictures?" "Of course you can. Mr. Su is here to see it on behalf of Mississippi. Whatever you do is what you should do." The staff said softly, "In fact, we send a video of it to Xixia State every week." Su Lu was silent for a while. In the end, he could not help but ask, "Didn't she find out the little rabbit she raised back then died long ago, and this is the other one?" On the 3rd floor of the side garden of the Zhong family's old house in the West Woods, the door to the balcony of the room facing the sun was closed. Zhong Ziki, with a gloomy expression, was talking to a staff member in front of him. His tone was particularly cold and irritable. "You said that stinky bodyguard actually entered my house and was even treated as a VIP? Why didn't anyone tell me?" He slammed the table angrily. The cup of tea on the table was about to spill out like his mood. As Zhong Laohu's favorite nephew, Zhong Ziki had a very unusual position in the Zhong family in the Westwoods, especially now that Madame Zhong was accompanying Miss Zhong in the capital ring and the commander was directing the war on the front lines. He was nominally under house arrest in the old house, but in reality, he was half a master. The staff member left. The anger on Zhong Ziki's face was quickly concealed. There was only cold silence. After the incident at the hotel, he knew that Su Lu had a good relationship with Madame Zhong and that little cousin. More importantly, he found out a lot about Su Li's background. He picked up the encrypted phone with a strange expression and dialed a number. After waiting for a few seconds, he still did not speak. Only when an impatient voice came from the other side of the line did he say in a low voice, "What do you want to do? You have to tell me the plan." The other side of the line was silent for a moment. Then, a cold and resentful voice sounded. "Our plan is very simple. It is to destroy this guy physically." Zhong Ziqi rubbed the space between his eyebrows and said, "You guys are crazier than I thought. Are you scared?" The voice on the other side of the line said mockingly, "Don't forget, although those old men and women are unwilling to speak, they actually want Su Lu to die more than we do. It's just that they are too embarrassed to make a move." You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.